The Arctic sky was never truly black. Even in the dead of winter, above the endless sheets of ice and snow, it carried faint veils of color, ghostly greens, shifting violets, bands of electric blue rolling across the heavens like whispers from another world. Pilots who flew the northern route spoke of the aurora with respect, even reverence. It wasn't just atmosphere or magnetism. It was alive, a moving skin draped across the planet. Captain Daniel Cross had grown used to the northern light in his 12 years flying patrols to the U.S. Air Force. He had crossed the pole more than most men cross the street outside their homes. He had learned the aurora's moods, soft, inviting veils that barely brushed the horizon and furious, twisting storms of color that churned like boiling rivers in the sky. But the night of December 12, 1982 was different. He sat strapped into the cockpit of his F-4 Phantom II, cruising at 32,000 feet over the Greenland ice cap, when the first ripple of unease entered his bones. The instruments were fine. The sky was clear. The wingman, Lieutenant Frank Morrison, flew in tight formation off his right side. Steady as ever, their squadron, 4 aircraft in total, stretched across the dark sky like beads on a string, a loose diamond pattern against a pale wash of starlight. Everything was standard, and yet, as Cross glanced upward, he saw something in the aurora that was not aurora. At first it looked like a star that refused to stay still. A point of light glimmered against a green veil, but instead of drifting with a flowing current, it cut through the curtain, sharp, deliberate, like a blade slicing silk. Eagle 1 to Eagle Flight. Anyone tracking that? Cross's voice broke over the secure channel, calm but clipped. Eagle 2, visual confirmed. Morrison answered almost instantly. Starboard high, 10 o'clock. Not a star. Eagle 3, copy. That was Lieutenant Harris, the youngest of the flight. His voice carried a slight edge, the nervous pitch of a man who hadn't yet learned to bury instinct under procedure. Colonel Reeves, the squadron commander flying lead, came last. His voice was the gravel of long cigarettes and longer nights. Keep formation. Maintain altitude. Don't chase ghosts. Cross wanted to obey, but the thing moved again. It zipped across the aurora like a dragonfly skating over water, faster than any aircraft, but not impossibly fast. Fast enough to trick the mind into thinking it could be man-made, if only man had reached just a little farther into the impossible. Then the radar told another story. Cross glanced down. His scope flickered, its green phosphorescent sweep catching the blip for less than a heartbeat before losing it. A smear, not a contact. A pulse of data that seemed to ripple rather than reflect. Painted it. Cross said, try and steady his voice. Lost it. Morrison swore under his breath. My scope just rebooted, like it hiccuped. They all felt it. Then a pressure in the cockpit, like the static charge before lightning, but inside the bones. The aurora above them thickened, shifting from pale green to violent emerald, threaded with crimson veins. The object, the not star, began to multiply. 1 became 3. 3 became 5. They hung in a line, silent, blue-white diamonds that pulsed with rhythm, as if answering each other across invisible wires. Colonel Reeves finally spoke again. Maintain course. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. But his voice was thinner now. Cross could tell the colonel had no explanation. For the next 5 minutes, the formation flew in eerie silence. The lights followed them, darting, weaving, never drawing too close, never fading away. The phantom engines roared steady. The radios hissed with empty static, and still the presence pressed against them, watching. Then came the voice. It did not come over the radio. It came inside. Cross stiffened as words not his own filled his mind, clear as if whispered in his ear. You are seen. He almost spoke aloud, but he froze. He risked a glance to his right. Morrison's head jerked slightly, helmet turning as if he too had heard something. Eagle 2, Cross began. I heard it. Morrison snapped. Jesus Christ, I heard it. The other 2 pilots broke discipline. Harris cursed over the channel, his voice cracking. Reeves barked an order that dissolved into static, his microphone squealing like it had been overloaded by some hidden frequency. And then the sky split open. The aurora convulsed, and the 5 lights surged downward, expanding as they moved, no longer stars but lattice work, geometric frameworks of radiant blue-white energy, lines and nodes, triangles folding into hexagons, hexagons bleeding into infinite grids. The air itself glowed. Cross's cockpit was awash in light, so bright he could see every rivet in his canopy frame, every crease in the leather of his gloves. The phantom shuddered. Instruments died, reborn, died again. The altimeter spun wildly. The artificial horizon snapped between extremes. Morrison's voice was raw in Cross's ear. Eagle One, my controls, just, I don't. Then Morrison's jet vanished. Not exploded. Not descended. Not peeled away. One moment it was there, flying in disciplined formation off Cross's starboard wing, and the next, the space it occupied was empty. The light folded around the absence like water over a stone. Jesus Christ. Harris screamed. 2 is gone, he's just gone. Cross felt his heart slam against his ribs. His eyes darted across the sky, searching for fire, debris, anything. But there was no wreckage, no trail, no signal. Just the sound of his own ragged breathing, and the lattice lights hovering with impossible serenity. Then Morrison spoke again. His voice came over the radio. Calm. Too calm. Eagle 2, holding formation. Cross blinked. His eyes scanned the night, desperate. The slot was empty. The wingman's phantom was not there. And yet Morrison's voice repeated, steady as if reciting, holding formation. Altitude steady. Flight systems nominal. Cross's skin crawled. He gripped the stick, so tight his gloves creaked. Morrison, respond. Where the hell are you? Holding formation. The voice said again, identical, clipped like a tape loop. The other pilots were shouting now. Disbelief and terror flooding the net. Colonel Reeves tried to restore order, but his words dissolved into broken syllables, fragment of command that sounded hollow even as he gave them. Cross's last clear thought of that night, before the light surged closer, before the lattice entered his cockpit and erased the boundary between man and sky, was a sickening certainty that Morrison was not gone. He had been taken. And whatever held him now was using his voice like a mask. They put Captain Daniel Cross in a room that smelled like old paper and new paint, which is to say, they intended him to feel both recorded and replaceable. No windows. One camera, the kind you pretend is a smoke detector if you want to flatter a man's dignity. On the table, a pitcher of water with 2 sweating glasses, as if courtesy could inoculate him against what was coming. He noticed the little things because pilots always do. The hum of the fluorescent ballast, the tick of a cheap wall clock that didn't match the sweeper's pulse, the way the chair's rear left leg wobbled a degree, a note out of tune in an orchestra that wanted obedience. 2 men entered together and closed the door with a soft click meant to sound harmless. One wore Air Force blue with ribbons that told the story of a career, without needing to boast. The other wore a gray suit that tried not to be federal and failed. The colonel set a folder down. The gray suit set down nothing. Cross decided, without warmth, that the suit had learned to travel light because other people carried his weight. Captain Cross, the colonel said, not sitting yet. His voice had the tired courtesy of a man who liked rules because they kept him from talking about belief. I'm Colonel Bishop. This is Mr. Keene. He didn't add an agency. Agencies are only said aloud when their names help. Sir, Cross kept his hands flat on the table, where everyone could see them. His knuckles still remembered the canopy glow. He had washed 3 times and could not get the smell of ionized air off his skin. Keene's smile was something he'd polished in glass. We appreciate your cooperation. We know you've had a night. Cross met the man's eyes and decided not to answer. Silence here was not refusal. It was a way to keep the room honest. Bishop sat. Keene didn't. He circled once, an animal measuring a pen, then folded himself into the opposite chair with a neatness that made Cross think of clipboards. We'll make a record, Bishop said. He clicked the recorder. The wheels turned with a soft, almost maternal sound of tape finding purchase. For the purposes of this interview, you consent to recording? Yes. State your name and rank. Captain Daniel Cross, United States Air Force. Unit, Eagle Flight, 46 Tactical Reconnaissance. His throat tightened on the last word. Flight had been a plural noun when the night began. Keen leaned forward just enough to be a presence. Captain, we're going to walk through the mission profile. You'll tell us what happened. You'll tell us exactly what you saw. His voice softened on Saul like he was offering indulgence. And what you heard. Cross stared at the water pitcher and didn't drink because thirst would have made him like them. Yes, sir. Bishop's questions began clean. Weather, fuel, ordnance, call signs. The transcript would look like competence, a neat left-hand column before the right-hand column learned to disobey. Cross answered evenly, grateful for nouns that didn't argue. Then Bishop asked, when did you first note the anomaly? Cross chose the word the sky, had already chosen. The lights? At 0320 Zulu. High starboard, cutting across the aurora. Cutting? Keen said, quick, not drifting, not riding the curtains, moving against the flow. He surprised himself by lifting his hand and drawing a line in the air, a knife through silk. He let his hand fall and hated the way his palm tingled, as if it had touched lattice again. Radar paint. Bishop asked. A smear, Cross said. Not a return, like it bent a sweep and gave it back wrong. He paused. We all saw it. Bishop nodded. Checked a page he already knew. Colonel Reeves acknowledged visual. Lieutenant Harris concurred. Lieutenant Morrison? Cross swallowed. He acknowledged. Keen tapped the folder. Let's talk about Lieutenant Morrison. Cross blinked slowly so he wouldn't break. Yes. You reported loss of visual on Eagle 2 at 0326. Keen didn't look at the clock. No fireball. No debris. No transponder. He was there, Cross said. And then he was not. Keen's eyebrows are the small, kind thing that says, I allow your grief, but not your conclusion. Pilots have collided with weather they didn't believe in before. Not this weather, Cross said. This spoke. Silence is a tactical instrument. Keen used it now, letting the word spoke settle into the tape, so he could look reasonable for not liking it. Bishop's eyes flickered at the clock. Not for time, but to let Cross see he was human. What did it say? Keen asked, as if asking a child to repeat a promise. Cross thought about lying. He thought about choosing nouns that would survive the next room. The next room always arrives. A conference table with men who have learned to keep their faces where their careers can see them. He decided against a lie because it would only leave him alone in a room with his own version of the tape. It said, you are seen. He didn't dress the sentence. He didn't make it plausible. He offered it like a dog tag found on a field. Keen's pen didn't move. Over the radio. No. In your headset. No. He put his fingertips to his temple before he could stop himself. Here. Keen let his gaze flick to Bishop for the smallest victory. Bishop didn't return it. He was busy hiding compassion. And after Lieutenant Morrison's disappearance, Keen said, you reported hearing his voice. Cross closed his eyes, and for a beat the interrogation room leaned like a cockpit in crosswind. We all did. Holding formation. Bishop read from the sheet, uninflected. Altitude steady. Flight systems nominal. Cross nodded. Did his voice respond to questions? No, Cross's jaw tightened. It repeated. Same cadence. Same clip. Like a loop. Like a mask, Cross said before he could swallow the cruelty. Like something wearing him to keep us quiet. The clock ticked. The tape turned. The water sweated. Keen steepled his fingers. Captain, listen to me carefully. There are explanations for a phenomenon in polar air that are not in your flight manual. Refraction. Ionospheric ducting, the auroral electrojet. Cross let a short laugh out where it couldn't be polite. The Aurora did not file a flight plan, he said, and it did not rehearse a man's voice. Bishop's next question had the shape of help. Did you experience any physiological effects? Headache, nausea, thermal sensation? Cross hesitated. The word thermal unlocked a piece of the night he had filed in a drawer marked later. Heat, he said. Not on the skin. In the hands. Like a tool warming before you pick it up. Bishop's pupils tightened. Keen leaned in. Described the heat. like I was holding something that could stop a second. He exhaled. And pay for it. The tape recorder made a small complaint, like a machine embarrassed by its own metaphors. Keen smoothed his tie as if to iron out Cross's sentence. Did you attempt to, stop a second? Cross stared at the picture until the glare off its curve was the only thing in the room. I froze. The cockpit paused. The instruments held their breath. He kept his voice level. Then everything cost more after. Bishop rubbed his thumb along the folder's edge, acquiring a paper cut on purpose to anchor himself in the world of blood and policy. Captain, I'm going to ask something you won't like. He waited exactly long enough for Cross to consent by not leaving. Were you in full control of your aircraft? No, Cross said. He let the word land. We were cooperating. With what? Keen's smile needed an answer to file. With intention, Cross said, and hated himself for how little the words protected him. Bishop's mouth made a line. The look of a man who knows commanding truth is different from believing it. Colonel Reeves' tape is degraded, he said carefully. A lot of static. Bursts. Interference. He was trying to command a room that refused human grammar. Keen slid a black and white photo from the folder. It showed nothing of comfort. For bright beads over Greenland ice, blurred by long exposure into little threads of certainty. These were taken by a weather station north of Thule, time-stamped within 5 minutes of your call. He tapped a pencil on the brightest bead. If these are the lights, they aren't lights. No, Cross said. They're the corners of something we don't have a word for. Bishop's voice softened as if he could pad the floor before Cross fell through. Captain, after Lieutenant Morrison's disappearance, you reported another event. The lattice, Cross said, and there was again the geometry rising the air of the room like frost. He swallowed. It came in, the cockpit filled with it. It was outside and inside. It didn't care where the canopy was. Did it touch you? Keen asked. It addressed me. Keen hid his satisfaction poorly. Words like address write themselves into boxes labeled psych. Bishop cut him off by asking something that mattered. Did you ask it anything back? Cross almost said no. Then he remembered the smallest prayer spoken between braced teeth when the first light cut the aurora. Don't take us apart. He put his forefinger on the sweating ring the pitcher had left on the table and drew an invisible circle. I told her we were seen, too. Bishop blinked. And it made room, Cross said. His throat burned, whether from shame or relief he couldn't tell. For a while, they paused. The clock ticked itself hoarse. The tape rolled a little looser on its spool. Keen said ungently, Captain, Lieutenant Morrison is missing. Yes. Men die in training, in weather, in war. Yes. What do I write in the box? Keen asked, and for once there was no malice in him at all, just the terrible fatigue of a clerk at the edge of myth. So his wife can live with it. Cross stared at the recorder, because its reels turned without believing, and yet turned anyway. Write that he was taken and kept speaking, he said. Keen sat back. Bishop looked down. The clock announced another minute none of them deserved. The door opened without a knock. A Major Croston stepped in and murmured into Bishop's ear. Bishop's jaw tightened. He clicked the recorder off, then remembered to say, off the record. Keen's eyes sharpened in a way that said the record we keep is not always the one with tape. Bishop slid a single page from the new folder. He read quietly, then read louder because the room needed to hear it. Thule Tower reports intermittent VHF carrier, no voice, on Eagle 2's assigned frequency. He looked at Cross. The carrier has the exact cadence of Lieutenant Morrison's previous transmissions. He's not broadcasting, Cross said. He's being warned. Keen rose in one quick, controlled movement. We're done. Bishop didn't stand. We're not, he said, more softly than refusal usually sounds. He looked at Cross with the helpless respect decent officers have for men who keep flying into places the manual didn't draft. Captain, I need you to write everything you remember, not the parts that will survive the next room, the parts that will survive you. Cross nodded once. Yes, sir. Keen's palm flattened on the folder, an instinct to hold down the paper, When the wind changes, there will be further interviews. There will be evaluation. He practiced the next sentence as he said it. There may be medical review. Cross looked at his hands, at the place the heat had lived, and saw nothing except the faintest tracery under the skin when the light hit his veins just right. He put his palms back on the table, as if to show he wasn't hiding anything. You can test what you like, he said, but if you want the truth, bring me a map and let me point where the sky turned into a room. Bishop stood. He didn't offer his hand because some gestures are for chapels, not offices. We'll get your statement typed. Keen opened the door. The corridor beyond was painted the same patient beige they use in places where men bring back the wrong weather. Cross rose. The chair's back leg wobbled again, that single note out of tune. He steadied it with a fingertip and left it better than he'd found it. Pilots do that. Repair what they can reach. At the threshold, Keen stopped him with a voice that forgave nothing and betrayed a little awe. Captain, when you said you were seen, did you feel mercy? Cross saw the 5 lights arrayed like a patient grammar of the way the lattice had entered without breaking, of Morrison's voice made into a uniform by something that didn't understand grief well enough to respect it. He swallowed and told the only honest thing. I felt a tension, he said. Mercy is a human word. They let him walk alone down the hall. Because men who have heard senses the sky does not write for everyone should be permitted at least that distance. At the end of the corridor, a secretary looked up with eyes that had already decided to believe him or not. He nodded to her as if he were passing her on a flight line at dawn. In the small bathroom, he braced his hands on a sink, so clean it squeaked. The mirror gave him a face he knew, older by the hour. He turned his palms toward the light. For a breath, thin, reluctant geometry glimmered beneath the skin and went out, like a pilot light that refused to boast. The speaker above the stall doors crackled with a bass feed. A weather update, a routine announcement, the dull music of safe and ordinary days. Between the sentences, for a fraction of time that cost him something to admit, he heard Morrison's cadence again, holding formation. The voice hadn't come from the speaker. It hadn't come from him. It had come from the shape of the room, remembering a man. Cross closed his hands into fists, so he wouldn't answer. Then he opened them again, because a pilot who stops opening his hands becomes a statue. When he returned to the interrogation room, Bishop was alone, writing longhand in a margin no one would ever archive. He looked up and regarded Cross with the exhaustive fraternity of men who keep faith with things they can't file. Captain, he said, and this time it did sound like mercy. Go home for a few hours, then come back and tell me the part you thought would embarrass us. Cross nodded and walked out into a base where jets taxiing the honest cold, where men in orange wands made arcs like hopeful priests, where the air did what air does. Carry, resist, remember. Behind him, on the tape spooling in the recorder, the sound of the room settling back into itself drew the faintest, barest pattern, clicks as regular as a heartbeat. No one heard it because no one was listening for Morse anymore. If they had, they might have translated the simplest word in any language. Scene. The Air Force has many rooms for men like Captain Daniel Cross. Some are made of cinder block and humming light. Others of polished wood and flag pins. But they all serve the same purpose. To grind down the rough edges of story until only something smooth enough to file remains. The third room he entered since the night of the encounter was narrower than the last, longer than necessary, a corridor pretending to be an office. The walls were painted in a green so pale it couldn't decide whether it be mint or mold. A single desk sat too far from the wall, as if dragged into position for a trial. On the desk, another recorder, another stack of forms, another man with no nameplate. This one wore the uniform of a psychologist. Cross had seen the type before. Doctors who spent more time in rooms like this than in hospitals, men whose clipboards were as much weapon as shield. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Bradley, though he never offered it. Cross saw the stitch tag when the man adjusted his jacket. Captain Cross, Bradley said. His voice was sanded smooth, the sort of sound you get from too many rehearsals. You've had some time to rest since your initial debrief. How are you feeling today? Cross sat straight, hands folded on his lap. Rested, sir. Good, good. We'll start simple. Any headaches? Nausea? Vivid dreams? No. Bradley clicked his pen, a sound that might as well have been a gavel. Let's talk about Lieutenant Morrison. Cross's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. Yes, sir. You reported that his aircraft vanished. Yes. No explosion, no debris, no radar return. Correct. But then you heard his voice. Cross said nothing. The clock ticked. The pen clicked again. Captain, I need you to appreciate the seriousness of this. We have protocols for lost aircraft. We have language for it. Failure of avionics. Spatial disorientation. Catastrophic mechanical malfunction. All of these we can write, and families can understand. But you've told us something different. You've said, his voice repeated, that it said the same words again and again. Cross finally nodded. Yes. And you believed it wasn't him. Cross raised his eyes, and for the first time let the full weight of the night cross his face. It wasn't belief. It was knowing. The way you know the difference between a live man and a recording. Bradley scribbled something. Could it have been stress? No. Could it have been your own mind supply his voice to fill the absence? No. Bradley leaned back. Then what was it? Cross wanted to answer. He wanted to give words to the shape of the terror, the feeling of being observed from the inside. But the language failed him. Every word felt like sandpaper against glass. He shook his head slowly. It was something using him, like a mask, like a tool. The psychologist studied him with that awful stillness men use when they want silence to do the cutting. Captain, I need you to understand the danger here. If your testimony suggests extraordinary claims, it will be treated as extraordinary stress. Stress can end careers. Cross felt the walls pressing in. The pale green became suffocating. With respect, sir, stress didn't erase a jet from formation. Bradley's pen paused. He looked down at his notes, then back up, measuring. Let's talk about what you felt. Not what you saw. What did you feel in your body? Cross thought of the cockpit. The way the lattice light had filled the space. The way his hands had burned with unseen heat. He thought of the way the stopwatch had glowed, the way seconds had seemed to freeze, and then exact their price. He exhaled through his teeth. Pressure, he said, like static inside my bones. Like I was being tuned, not just watched. Bradley wrote something quickly. Tuned. Yes, as if I were an instrument. The pen scratched. The light hummed. The air seemed thinner. Did the voice, the one you reported, say anything else? Cross hesitated. He remembered too well. He remembered the phrase that had carved itself into his skull, bright as the aurora itself. You are seen. Yes, he admitted. It said we were seen. And you believed it. I didn't believe it, Cross said. His voice cracked, but he didn't flinch. I experienced it. The psychologist tapped his pen 3 times, sharp little blows to the desk. Captain, I want you to think carefully. Is it possible you've misinterpreted electrical noise, auroral static, ionospheric echo? These things are well documented in the Arctic. Cross leaned forward. His knuckles whitened against the desk. Sir, I've flown the Arctic for 12 years. I know auroral static. I know ground clutter and ionospheric ducting. This was not that. This was intelligence. Deliberate, directed. The silence afterward was heavier than the words themselves. Bradley sighed. He leaned back in his chair, closing his notebook. We'll continue this tomorrow. Cross blinked. That's it. For now. 2 MPs escorted him back to quarters that felt less like rest and more like holding. He sat on the narrow bed, staring at the wall until dawn crept through the blinds. He didn't sleep. He didn't blink much, either. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the lattice again, geometry alive, pressing against his ribs from the inside. And every so often, faint as static, he heard Morrison's voice repeating. Holding formation, altitude steady, flight systems nominal. Only now, Cross realized the cadence was changing, becoming less mechanical, more natural, as if something was learning how to sound human. Home was supposed to be a refuge, but Daniel Cross felt like he was carrying the interrogation room inside his bones. The pale green walls of the psychologist's office had followed him back across the base, into the car, through the front door of his own house, and now they colored the air of his dining room. He sat at the head of the table as if it were another witness box, with his wife and daughter staring at him from across the spread of food he could not eat. Laura, his wife, had set the table carefully: roasted chicken, potatoes, steamed vegetables, even a lemon pie that usually drew a smile from him no matter how bad the day. Tonight, he couldn't touch it. He barely lifted his fork. His hand trembled once, just enough for his daughter, Emily, to notice. She was 12, old enough to read the silences of adults, young enough to believe they could still be fixed. Her wide eyes kept darting from her father to her mother, as if she were following the storm on the horizon. "Daddy," she said softly, "did something happen on your flight?" Cross froze. The room seemed to tilt. His throat closed around words he couldn't release. Laura intervened. Her voice was sharp, the way a woman's voice sharpens when she has been worrying in silence too long. "Emily, finish your potatoes." "But, Mom." "Now." Emily lowered her head, pushing food around her plate. Cross stared at his wife. Her eyes were red, tired from nights of waiting and worrying. She didn't look at him the way she used to. There was suspicion there now, and anger, and a kind of fear that refuses to admit its own name. "What did they tell you?" Laura asked finally, breaking the silence like a plate shattering on tile. "Who?" "The Air Force. Whoever locked you in that room for hours. Whoever's been making you come home like a ghost." Cross rubbed his hands together, feeling again the heat that wasn't heat, the pressure that had filled his bones. He wanted to tell her. He wanted to pour out every detail: the lights, the lattice, Morrison's disappearance, the voice in the skull. But he also knew what Keene had implied in the interrogation room. Extraordinary claims would be treated as extraordinary stress. And stress could end not only his career, but the fragile balance of his family. "They just had questions," he said. "Questions about what?" "The mission." "Daniel." Her voice cracked, and for the first time in weeks, her hand trembled as it gripped the edge of the table. "I can tell when you're lying to me." "Don't do that. Not here. Not in front of her." Cross lowered his gaze. Emily had stopped eating altogether, her fork resting useless on the plate. She stared at him with something too big for her 12-year-old frame: disappointment. "I can't talk about it," he said finally. The words tasted like betrayal. Laura laughed bitterly. "You can't talk about it, or you won't." Cross clenched his jaw. "I'm protecting you." "Protecting us from what?" "From your silence. From whatever is tearing you apart in there." She jabbed a finger toward his chest, then let it fall, as if even anger could not summon enough strength to stay upright. "You come home every night and sit there like a shadow. You don't sleep. You don't touch me. You don't even look at us. And you call that protection?" Cross wanted to shout back, to defend himself, to say the words he'd been carrying like contraband. It said we were seen. But if he said it, if he let it into this room, then the same lattice that had invaded his cockpit would invade his family. And that he could not allow. So he said nothing. The silence stretched until it hurt. Emily pushed her chair back and left the table without a word. The sound of her footsteps retreating down the hallway echoed louder than the roar of the Phantom's engines. Laura stood too, gathering plates with trembling hands. She moved to the sink, her back to him. The clatter of dishes became the soundtrack of defeat. Cross remained at the table, staring at the empty chair across from him. He thought of Morrison, of the way his slot in formation had gone empty, the way his voice had lingered even after his body had disappeared. Now his own dinner table looked the same, a place where someone had been, and then was not. His hands trembled again. For a moment, in the reflection of the polished fork beside his plate, he thought he saw lines of light, geometry crawling across the metal like frost. He blinked, and it was gone. But the pressure remained, a weight that made the air itself harder to breathe. He realized with horror that he was no longer certain whether the interrogation was happening at the base or here in his own home. And for the first time, Daniel Cross wondered if he had brought the sky's attention back with him. The Air Force bar on Thule Air Base wasn't glamorous, and that was precisely its strength. It was a box of brick and neon in the middle of ice, a place where the heat of too many bodies and too much whiskey made men forget the killing cold waiting outside. The jukebox hadn't worked since Carter was in office. The dartboard sagged. The beer was cheap, the whiskey cheaper, and the conversations alternated between locker room bravado and the kind of silence only military men understood. The silence of things they couldn't admit anywhere else. Captain Daniel Cross slipped inside without his uniform cap, his collar loosened just enough to mark him as off-duty. He hoped anonymity would shield him, but a dozen pairs of eyes turned anyway. Word had spread. Pilots always know when something has gone wrong, even when no one tells them. He ordered a whiskey neat and found a corner table in the shadow, his back to the wall. The glass sweated cold against his palm, and for a moment he stared into it as though the answer might be written in amber. But the only thing reflected back at him was his own hollow face. The laughter of younger pilots rose and fell around the room. They were playing cards, boasting about maneuvers, swapping lies about women in Anchorage. Cross envied them the simplicity of their world. He knew they envied him, too, for his hours, his rank, his reputation. None of them envied what he had seen, though they didn't know enough to name it. The chair across from him scraped. He looked up to see Major Dalton lowering himself onto it, a heavy glass in his hand. Dalton was older, his hair thinning, his face lined by years of Arctic wind and jet exhaust. He had flown more sorties than most of the squadron combined. He was the kind of man who carried weight without speaking, because everyone around him already knew he had survived things they couldn't imagine. "Whiskey?" Dalton asked, nodding at Cross's glass. "Yeah." "Good. Means you're still human." They sat in silence for a few beats. Dalton sipped his drink, his eyes steady on Cross. Finally he spoke. "I heard about Morrison." Cross swallowed. "What did you hear?" "That he's gone. That you saw it." Dalton's voice was low, flat, too certain to be gossip. "And that you heard something after." Cross's stomach nodded. He had told no one outside the interrogation rooms. "Who told you that?" Dalton smiled grimly. "Son, in this business, nothing stays buried. Pilots talk. Radios bleed. Tape leaks. And men like me have long memories." Cross studied him. "You've seen it before." Dalton nodded slowly. "Not the same. Never the same. But enough to know when the sky takes notice." He leaned forward, lowering his voice until only Cross could hear. "Tell me exactly what you saw." Cross hesitated. His training screamed at him to shut up, to protect classified details, to protect himself. But something in Dalton's eyes, something old, haunted, and unashamed, gave him permission. He spoke. He told Dalton about the lights that weren't lights, about the lattice folding down from the aurora, about Morrison's jet vanishing without a trace. He described the voice that had spoken inside his head, the repetition of Morrison's cadence after the man himself was gone, the heat in his hands, the sensation of being tuned. He spoke in a rush, the way drowning men gasp when air finally arrives. Dalton listened without interruption. He didn't laugh, didn't dismiss, didn't even flinch. He just drank slowly, eyes locked on Cross, nodding now and then as though the words were bricks laid on an already built wall. When Cross finished, the bar seemed louder, the laughter of the younger pilot sharper and more unreal. He leaned back, exhausted. "That's it," he said. "That's what happened." Dalton set his glass down. His expression was grave, but not surprised. "They'll try to bury this," he said. "They'll call it stress, auroral interference, anything but what it was." "You believe me?" Dalton nodded once. "Because I've seen it too." Cross's breath caught. "When?" "Greenland, 74. Northern Patrol. Different crew. Different night. Same lights. Same feeling in the bones." Dalton's gaze drifted for a moment, as though he were watching the memory replay on the smoke-stained walls of the bar. "One of ours vanished. Just like Morrison. No wreckage. No mayday. Just gone." Cross's heart pounded. "What did they tell you?" "The same thing they'll tell you. That it never happened. That we were tired, disoriented, confused." Dalton's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. But confusion doesn't leave you hearing a man's voice after he's gone. The words hit Cross like a hammer. He looked around the bar at the younger pilots, laughing over their cards. He realized with sick clarity that one day, one of them would vanish too, and the cycle would repeat. "What do we do?" he asked. Dalton leaned closer, his voice a whisper now. We remember. We talk to each other, not just to the tape. And we keep flying, because that's the only way to prove we're still here. Cross stared into his whiskey, the amber liquid trembling in the glass. For the first time since that night, he felt a sliver of something beyond fear. Solidarity. He wasn't alone. The sky had taken others, and the men left behind had carried the burden in silence. But Dalton's eyes told him something else, something unspoken. The sky would take again, and next time it might be him. The cassette recorder sat on Daniel Cross's desk like a loaded weapon. Its red light glowed faintly in the dim study, the only illumination aside from the desk lamp that carved long shadows across the walls. Cross stared at it for a long time before pressing the button. The reels began to spin with a software that seemed louder than the wind battering the eaves outside. "This is Captain Daniel Cross," he whispered, his voice rough. "Date, December 14th, 1982. Off duty. Personal log. Not Air Force property." He paused, listening to the sound of his own breath on tape. "I can't trust the record they're keeping. I can't trust the questions they're asking. Every room I've been in since the night over Greenland has felt less like an investigation and more like a containment. They don't want answers. They want silence. So I'm making my own record." He shifted in his chair. The springs creaked. He rubbed his eyes, which burned with fatigue that no sleep could fix. 2 nights ago, Morrison vanished. I say vanished because no other word fits. He was there, and then he was not. His jet did not explode. It did not descend. It did not peel away. It ceased, and yet his voice remained. Cross's throat tightened. He reached for the glass of water on the desk, took a sip, and continued. "They played me the tapes. The psychologists call it stress-induced auditory imprinting. The spooks call it an anomaly. The brass call it nothing at all. But I know what I heard. I know what I still hear. Morrison's cadence, repeating, like a phonograph needle stuck in the groove of reality itself." He leaned closer to the recorder, his whisper growing more urgent. "And I know what else I heard. Words that weren't his. Words that didn't belong to any human throat. 'You are seen.' That's what it said. Not over the radio, not in the headset. Inside. Inside my skull. Inside my bones." He shut his eyes. The darkness behind them was alive with memory, with lattice lines that folded and unfolded in impossible geometry. I've been carrying it with me ever since. At home, at the base, even here in this room, I can feel it watching, like I've been tagged, like a signal has been burned into me, and now I'm a receiver. The tape hissed softly, the sound of emptiness between his words. I can't talk to Laura. I can't look at Emily without feeling like I brought something dangerous back through the door. They deserve safety. I can't give it. Not anymore. So I live 2 lives now. One for them. One for me. And the second one is the only one that's honest. He stopped, pinching the bridge of his nose, fighting against the migraine blooming in his skull. I don't know how long I can keep this hidden. I don't know how long before they notice what it's doing to me. Maybe they already know. Maybe that's why the psychologists and the men in suits keep circling me, asking the same questions in different rooms. They're not investigating. They're measuring how long it takes before a man breaks under the weight of being seen. The study creaked as the wind pressed against the walls. The shadows shifted. Cross glanced up, heart pounding, certain for a moment that he saw movement. Lines of light crawling across the wallpaper like frost spreading on glass. He blinked, and they were gone. He leaned back in his chair, pressing his palms flat on the desk. Morrison's voice hasn't stopped. I hear it at night. I hear it when I'm walking across the flight line. Sometimes I swear it's not repeating anymore. Sometimes it's evolving, learning. He swallowed hard. If anyone finds these tapes, if I don't make it through whatever this is, then let this be the record. I was there. I saw it. I heard it. It was real. And if Morrison is still speaking, then he is not gone. He is somewhere. Somewhere the Air Force won't write down. Somewhere science can't measure. But somewhere, Cross reached forward and clicked the stop button. The reel slowed. The red light winked out, and the silence that filled the room afterward was heavier than anything the tape had captured. He sat there for a long time, staring at the dark recorder, until he realized with dread certainty that the shadows on the wall weren't just shadows anymore. They were outlines, shapes, geometry folding and unfolding, faint and patient. The recorder hadn't captured everything. Some things refused to be recorded. Some things lived only in the man who had been chosen to hear them. The word ghost was not written anywhere in the file, but everyone who handled it seemed to treat it like one. Captain Elias Reyes first saw it 2 weeks after his second official interrogation. By then, he already understood that the Air Force had built a wall around him, a cage made of clipped conversations, silent phone lines, and watchful stares. He wasn't suspended, not officially, but he wasn't clear to fly either. His logbook entries had stopped. His squadron mates had stopped asking questions. The silence around him was heavier than any reprimand. That morning, he was summoned without warning. A sergeant knocked on his motel door at 5:15, told him to dress in uniform, and offered no further explanation. The car that collected him was black, unmarked, the windows smoked. Inside, 2 men sat in silence, their posture too rigid for enlisted men. They said nothing, and Reyes didn't ask. He knew by now that questions earned only longer silences. They drove him to an annex building on the base he had never entered before. The hallways were sterile, fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead, the paint too fresh on the walls. It was a building made to look ordinary, which only made it stand out. The room they ushered him into was bare except for a steel table, 3 chairs, and a folder. The folder was thick, stamped classified in red block letters across the cover. But what caught Reyes's eye was the way the 2 men in dark suits looked at it. One of them set it down carefully, like it contained more than paper. Neither introduced themselves. They didn't need to. Reyes had heard enough rumors about special review officers to know these weren't Air Force brass in uniform. These were shadows given temporary shape. Captain Reyes, the taller one, said finally, "We're going to review your testimony." Again. The second man opened the folder, flipped pages without letting Reyes see. Then, with a practiced movement, he slid a single sheet forward. It wasn't typed. It wasn't neat. It looked like a photocopy of a radar sweep, blurred and smudged. But across the middle of the arc, thick black pen had drawn jagged lines, shapes that looked almost geometric, but not quite human-made. The pen mark circled an anomaly that pulsed faintly even on paper, as if the copier had captured movement. "Do you recognize this?" Reyes stared. His throat went dry. He did recognize it. Not the exact sweep, but the pattern. Those angles, those impossible grids, were burned into his memory from that night above the Arctic. He forced his voice level. "It's similar to what I saw on my scope." "Similar?" the shorter man asked, his tone sharp enough to cut. "Or exact?" Reyes hesitated. The truth was he couldn't tell. His mind replayed the green glow of the radar, the way the shapes had shimmered and bent, like frozen lightning caught in the wrong dimension. But this paper image, flat, smudged, was a ghost of that terror. "Similar," he said finally. The taller man leaned forward. "Captain, this file isn't supposed to exist. Do you understand?" Reyes blinked. "Sir." This sweep was logged, then deleted. The deletion was ordered by a colonel 3 layers above your chain of command. Yet here it is. Someone copied it before it vanished. That makes it the ghost file. The word sank into Reyes like ice. Ghost file. Evidence that should not be. Evidence someone wanted erased, yet someone else wanted preserved. The shorter man slid another page forward. This one was worse. A typed transcript of an AWACS controller reporting multiple contacts over the bearing. Half the lines were blacked out. But one sentence remained clear. Objects hold course. Lattice formation. Not responding to beacon. Reyes felt his stomach twist. He remembered the voice crackling in his headset. The disbelief of another man seeing the same thing. Proof he hadn't been alone in his terror. Proof he wasn't insane. "You never mentioned this phrase in your statements," the taller man said. "Because I never heard it." Reyes snapped before he could stop himself. They cut the transmission before it finished. Silence. The 2 men exchanged a glance. Reyes realized it slipped too late. By acknowledging the cut, he'd admitted to noticing the gap, the edit. That wasn't something a pilot was supposed to admit. The shorter man's eyes hardened. You will not speak of this file. Not to your wife. Not to your daughter. Not to your priest. Do you understand? Reyes's fists clenched on the table, nails digging into his palms. Then why show it to me? The taller man closed the folder with a soft, deliberate thud. Because we need to know how much you remember, and how much you can forget. The words hung in the air, heavier than any order Reyes had ever received. That night, back in his motel room, Reyes sat at the desk, staring at the cassette recorder he had hidden inside a shoebox. The red light winked at him, waiting. His hand trembled as he pressed record. They have a file, he whispered into the dark. They called it a ghost. It's proof. Proof they're lying. Proof they're hiding it. The radar wasn't just me. It was on record. Someone tried to erase it. Someone else saved it. That means there's a war inside the silence. His breath came faster. He turned off the recorder, shoved the tape deep into the shoebox, and buried it under clothes. But even then, he couldn't shake the feeling that the room itself was listening. When he finally slept, he dreamed of the radar sweep glowing in the dark, pulsing like a heartbeat that was not his own. And when he woke, the dream had left a mark, faint geometric afterimages dancing across his vision, as if the ghost file had followed him out of sleep. Reyes didn't know it yet, but the ghost file was more than evidence. It was bait. The men who showed it to him weren't testing his memory. They were testing his loyalty. And in the weeks to come, the cost of that test would rise higher than he could imagine. The orders had been clear. A routine night patrol over the frozen vastness of the North Slope. Nothing unusual, nothing to report. Captain Elias Reyes had flown the circuit a dozen times in the past 2 months, his Phantom's canopy filled with the endless dark of Arctic skies. It was monotonous duty, comfortably so, until that night. The radar operator's voice cracked through the headset first, a tone sharper than usual. Eagle 2 confirmed. You have eyes on this? Sector 307, bearing northeast. Blips intermittent, altitude unstable. Reyes frowned. He leaned closer to the glowing green scope. The screen flickered with something that should not have been there. For sharp contacts, blinking in and out of existence, jumping across the sweep in ways no aircraft should. They didn't behave like Russian bombers or even experimental drones. They flickered, as if reality itself couldn't pin them down. His wingman, Lieutenant Carter, came on comms. Eagle 1, this isn't standard. There, look how they're jumping. That's impossible. Outside the canopy, the world was still black, only the faint aurora rippling green and violet on the horizon. But then Reyes saw it. Faint blue-white shimmer, pulsing like heat lightning far ahead. It wasn't a flare, wasn't a star. It had shape, angles, geometry. The Phantom cut through the night, and Reyes felt a pull in his chest he couldn't name. His hands tightened on the yoke. The radar beeped in steady protest as the shapes multiplied. The scope became a hive of impossible contacts, all layered over each other, refusing the rules of physics. Command, this is Eagle 2. Reyes forced his voice steady. We have unknown radar activity, multiple returns, non-ballistic, non-aircraft behavior, requesting immediate instructions. There was silence, long enough that both pilots exchanged glances they couldn't see. Finally, Command answered, voice flat. Eagle Flight, continue course. Observe only. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. Carter cursed into his oxygen mask. Observe what? They're dancing all over the goddamn scope. Then came the light. It wasn't gradual. It was like the sky itself tore open. A lattice of cold blue-white geometry erupted at the horizon. Lines crossing lines, angles cutting across the aurora until the heavens looked carved by impossible architects. Reyes' heart hammered against his ribs. The geometry didn't just appear. It resonated, as if it had been there all along, waiting for eyes to tune into it. The radar went berserk. Alarm screamed. Both pilots shouted over each other. Reyes tried to steady his breath. His training told him to trust instruments, but the instruments had gone insane. The sweep froze, then jumped, then painted the same contact in 50 different places at once. It's in the sky, Jesus, Elias. It's right in front of us. Carter shouted, and it was The shimmer resolved into a lattice, a structure that seemed both infinite and close enough to touch. It wasn't solid in any human sense. Reyes could see stars through it, distorted, bent like light through warped glass. The aurora threaded itself through the lattice, pulsing brighter, as though the geometry commanded it. For a moment, Reyes forgot to breathe. He felt small, smaller than he'd ever felt in combat, smaller than in simulators, smaller than when he first saw the Earth's curve at altitude. This wasn't sky. This was something that had claimed the sky, and maybe always had. The phantom shuddered. The instruments dimmed. Then silence. No engine roar. No radio chatter. Nothing but his own blood thundering in his ears. The world outside moved without sound, as if sound itself had been shut off. Then, faintly, he heard a whisper. Not Carter. Not command. A whisper inside his skull. Not words. Not English. A vibration shaped into thought. Aligned. He jerked, slammed his helmet against the seat, shook his head. Negative. I'm not. What the hell was that? Carter broke through the silence, voice high. I heard. I don't know what I heard. Reyes pulled the phantom into a bank, desperate to break free, but the geometry shifted with him. No matter the heading, the lattice folded, rearranged, always in front, always around. The radar showed distances that contradicted themselves. One returned at 30 miles, another at 500 feet. Both the same object. Both true. Both impossible. Command crackled faintly back. Voice distorted. Eagle 2. Report status repeat. Eagle 2. Reyes' hand shook. He forced his voice steady. Command, we're surrounded by unknowns. Geometry in the sky. Radar unreliable, visual contact confirmed. This is not. Repeat, this is not standard aerospace contact. Request abort. Static swallowed the reply. The lattice pulsed once, twice, then collapsed inward like folding paper. The stars blinked back into clarity. The aurora dimmed to its normal, gentle glow. The radar returned to empty sweep. Just like that. Gone. Reyes gasped, his lungs finally dragging in full air again. Sweat beaded down his neck. Carter's voice broke the silence. Did we? Elias, tell me you saw that. Tell me I didn't just lose my goddamn mind. Reyes swallowed hard. You saw it. We both did. His voice cracked. And now we can't ever unsee it. He didn't report everything in the debrief. Neither did Carter. But the tapes, the black box recordings, the radar logs, they captured more than silence. When replayed, there were faint bursts of static shaped into patterns, like geometry translated into sound. Analysts flagged it. Higher command stamped it, classified. That night, Reyes dreamed of the lattice. He woke with the word still vibrating in his skull. Aligned. The storm had not broken. It had only shifted, buried itself in the silence of the radar tapes and the bruised minds of the pilots who had witnessed it. For Elias Reyes, the lattice had not vanished. It had only receded, folded itself back into the sky like something patient. And patience was worse than terror. Terror surged and broke like a wave. Patience lingered. Days passed. Briefings came and went. Carter avoided him now, as though speaking aloud what they'd seen would pull it back into the world. Reyes tried to fly the way he had always flown, checkless, steady hands, reflexive trust in instruments, but nothing in the cockpit felt like it had before. Every sweep of radar felt alive, every silence charged. Then came the order. Another patrol, another night over the frozen spine of Alaska. This time, Reyes knew before he even left the tarmac that something was waiting. The Phantom's engine screamed into the night, cutting against winds that felt thicker than air. Reyes checked the scope compulsively. Empty sweeps. Empty sweeps. Then a flicker. A blip that wasn't supposed to be there. He swallowed hard. It was the same bearing as before, the same sector. Command Eagle 2. Picking up intermittent returns. Grid 307. Request confirmation. Static. Then a voice he didn't recognize. Eagle 2. Continue on course. Observe only. Do not engage. The same words. The exact same cadence. It chilled him more than the contact itself. Carter's voice crackled in, Eagle 1 to Eagle 2. I'm seeing it too. Jesus Christ, Elias, it's back. Ahead, the sky seemed thicker, darker than the rest. Reyes could see faint motes, like dust caught in sunlight, except there was no sun here, only the aurora's low shimmer. The motes twisted into lines. The lines bent into angles, geometry knitting itself together in silence. Reyes gripped the yoke until his knuckles blanched. His instruments jittered, then froze. The altimeter spun without moving. The airspeed locked on numbers that made no sense. Carter, do you see? He didn't finish, because outside the canopy, the lattice flared back into being. Not in the distance this time. Not faint. It filled the sky ahead, sharp and unyielding, as though the jet had been pulled inside an architecture too vast for comprehension. The phantom rattled. The radio cut. And the whisper returned, not in his ears, but in his bones. A resonance he could not escape. Aligned. Reyes gasped, as though he had been submerged underwater and dragged up too fast. He wanted to scream back, to tell it he wasn't aligned, but his throat seized. The geometry pulsed with every beat of his heart, or perhaps his heart pulsed with it. He couldn't tell anymore. Carter's voice ripped through the comms, panicked. It's inside my cockpit. It's in here with me. Oh, God. Reyes jerked his head around, trying to glimpse Carter's jet through the distortion. The sky itself seemed to bend, light folding as though space was cloth being twisted. For a second he saw 2 phantoms, then 4, then none. His wingman's jet blinked in and out of view, ghost-like. Reyes forced his voice into the channel. Stay with me, Carter. Stay on my wing. Don't let it pull you. But Carter was gone. Not exploded, not destroyed. Just gone as if erased. The scope showed his transponder signal flickering in 50 places at once, then vanishing altogether. Reyes was alone. The lattice flared brighter, cold white burning through his visor. The controls under his hands no longer felt like metal. They vibrated, humming with a frequency he felt in his teeth. His vision narrowed. He wasn't looking at the gauges anymore. He was looking through them, through the phantom, through himself. Then silence. The lattice folded inward again, collapsing like paper in fire. The aurora returned, faint and weak. The radar swept its empty arc. The engines roared as though nothing had happened. But Carter was gone. Reyes' breath tore out of him in ragged gasps. Command, Eagle 2, do you read me? I've lost Eagle 1. Repeat, Eagle 1 is gone. Static. Then, Eagle 2, return to base. Do not deviate. Do not discuss over open channel. He almost screamed. Did you hear me? He's gone. He disappeared. No reply. Only the steady hiss of dead air. Reyes flew home with his hands trembling, his eyes darting at every shadow in the sky. The runway lights felt unreal, artificial, as if even Earth had been rewritten. He taxied to the line, shut down the engines, and sat motionless in the dark cockpit until ground crew pulled him out. The debrief was a blur. Officers with blank faces. Notes scribbled. Questions phrased like accusations. Did you lose visual before disappearance? Could Eagle 1 have entered a spin? Was there engine malfunction? They didn't want answers. They wanted deniability. But the tapes told a different story. The radar showed Carter's jet multiplying, fracturing across the sweep. The comm logs carried fragments of his last transmission. Words stretched, broken into geometry of sound. Engineers argued the tapes were corrupted. Analysts stamped them classified. Reyes went home that night to his wife's worried eyes. His daughter's questions. He couldn't answer them. He couldn't even answer himself. Because when he closed his eyes, he didn't see Carter's jet vanish. He saw it align, pulled not into destruction, but into order. The whisper lingered in his skull, like an echo that would never fade. Aligned. The summons came less than 24 hours after Carter's disappearance. Reyes had hardly slept. He had sat in his dark kitchen with a cup of coffee that turned cold long before dawn, staring at the table without drinking. His wife hovered. His daughter peeked from the hallway, but no one spoke. There was no language for what he had witnessed. When the phone rang at 0700 sharp, He knew before he lifted the receiver that it wasn't an invitation. It was a command. Captain Reyes, report to headquarters. Full dress uniform. Immediate. The line went dead before he could respond. The colonel's office was a pristine theater of power. Flags framed the polished desk. Medals gleamed from velvet displays. The air smelled faintly of leather and disinfectant, as though even bacteria had been warned not to intrude. Reyes stood at attention, hands damp against his trouser seams, staring at the single folder that lay between them, stamped across the cover in heavy red. Confidential. Colonel Harrington was not a man who wasted words. His square jaw seemed carved from stone, his voice a blunt instrument. Sit. Reyes sat. The chair felt deliberately low, forcing him to look upward into the colonel's cold blue eyes. Harrington flipped the folder open with the precision of a surgeon. Inside were sheets of radar data, transcripts of comm chatter, technical diagrams, and finally, at the bottom, a thin photograph, a blurred frame from the black box recording, a lattice of light faintly etched against the night sky. Carter's phantom half dissolved into it. Explain, Harrington said. Reyes swallowed. His throat was dry. Sir, we encountered structures, not craft in any conventional sense. A geometric phenomenon, non-ballistic, non-aerodynamic. The radar showed. The colonel's hand snapped up. Stop. Not what you believe. What you can prove. Reyes blinked. The tapes. Corrupted, Harrington said flatly. The engineers have already logged anomalies. Data inconsistency. Magnetic interference. Faulty instruments. Reyes felt his pulse quicken. With respect, sir, that's not possible. Both aircraft experienced. Captain. Harrington leaned forward. His voice dropped to a knife-edge whisper. Do you know what happens to pilots who bring back ghost stories? Reyes clenched his fists under the desk. Sir, Lieutenant Carter, he's gone. I watched him vanish. This isn't a story. The colonel's stare hardened. You lost visual contact during a night patrol in poor atmospheric conditions. Your wingman likely entered a spin, disoriented by aurora refraction. Tragic, yes. Extraordinary, no. That's not what happened. Then what did happen, Captain? That a hole opened in the sky and swallowed him whole? That the laws of physics bent to accommodate your nightmares? Harrington's voice cut through the office like artillery fire. Think very carefully about your answer. The silence pressed like weight. Reyes could hear his own heartbeat. He knew the truth of what he had seen, but he also knew the room was designed to crush truth into compliance. Finally, he said quietly, I can't explain it in conventional terms, sir. The colonel leaned back, steepling his fingers. For the first time, a ghost of a smile tugged at his lips. Good, because that's the only acceptable answer. The judgment was not written in words, but in the narrowing of options. Reyes was told he would remain grounded pending medical review. He would submit to psychiatric evaluations. He would not discuss the patrol outside classified channels. His flight log would list loss of wingman, cause undetermined, and he would sign the non-disclosure agreement laid out before him, or his career would evaporate. The pen felt heavy in his hand. He hesitated long enough for Harrington's eyes to sharpen. The colonel didn't need to threaten. The walls, the flags, the medals, all was threat embodied. At last Reyes scrawled his signature. Harrington closed the folder with quiet finality. You're dismissed. Outside, the hallway stretched long and sterile. Reyes walked like a man underwater, each step slow, muffled. Officers passed without meeting his eyes. The base felt foreign now, hostile, as though the very air bristled with secrets. When he stepped into daylight, the Alaskan cold hit him like a slap. He drew it deep into his lungs, desperate to feel something real. But that night, alone in his study, the real felt thin. He laid out the tapes, the scribbled notes, the fragments he had salvaged before the investigators swept them away. He replayed Carter's last transmission again and again, hearing not words but shapes, bursts of static that seemed carved into angles. He traced them on paper, hands shaking, until the page was filled with lines that mirrored the lattice in the sky. A line, the word echoed in his skull. He did not know if it was memory or intrusion. Colonel Harrington filed his report the next morning. Pilot demonstrates signs of stress, probable misinterpretation of atmospheric phenomena, recommend continued evaluation. The file was stamped, logged, and buried in archives that would never see sunlight. The official story would hold. But Harrington paused for one moment before locking the folder away. He studied the blurred photograph again, the phantom dissolving into light, the lattice frozen mid-pulse. His jaw tightened. He slid the photo into his breast pocket instead of the archive. Some judgments, even colonels could not finalize. The study became a bunker, not one of sandbags and steel, but of paper, tape reels, and silence. After the colonel's judgment, after the humiliating performance in that sterile office, Captain Elias Reyes understood that the institution he had pledged his life to would not protect him. It would contain him, control him, bury him if necessary. And so he began his quiet rebellion, not with defiance shouted in a hangar, but with whispers into a cassette recorder, red light glowing like a conspirator in the dark. The first tape was simple. He logged every detail of the patrol, every anomaly, every flicker of radar, every second of silence where the world seemed erased. He spoke of Carter's panic, of the way his wingman's jet blinked in and out of existence. He described the lattice, how its light wasn't light at all but structure, how it pulsed like a heartbeat synchronized with his own. His words cracked under the weight of memory, but he forced them out. Documentation was survival. He hid the tape beneath floorboards in the corner of his study, not because he thought investigators would search his home, though they might, but because he couldn't bear to leave it in plain sight. The knowledge had to be buried, as he'd been buried, one layer deeper than the world above. Each night, he returned to the recorder. His wife began to notice. She would linger in the doorway, her voice soft but edged with fear. "Elias, it's late. Come to bed." He would nod, smile weakly, promise to follow. But he never did until hours later, after the whisper of the tape reels filled the house with their mechanical lullaby. The tapes grew stranger as the days passed. At first they were accounts, attempts at truth, but soon they became confessions. "I can still hear it," he whispered into the machine. "The word, not in English, not in sound. In me, aligned. I don't know if it's memory or if it's still happening." Sometimes he would stop speaking, only to realize he had been silent for minutes, staring into the shadows, listening for something behind the walls. Then he would rewind the tape and hear faint disturbances, static that hadn't been there before, bursts shaped like patterns, like angles. He traced them in his notebook, filling page after page with lines that bent and folded. He didn't know if he was decoding or being instructed. One evening, as snow battered the windows and the house groaned under the weight of Alaskan wind, he played back a reel while his family slept upstairs. The hiss filled the room, steady, ordinary. Then, between breaths, a new sound. Not words, not static. A pulse. Slow, deliberate. He froze. Rewound. Played again. Pulse. Pulse. Matching his heartbeat. He yanked the headphones off and sat trembling in the dark. His eyes drifted to the recorder's red light. For the first time, it looked less like a tool and more like an eye. The next day at the base, the psychiatrist asked routine questions. Any trouble sleeping? Any dreams? Reyes lied with precision. No more than usual, just stress. He watched the doctor's pen scratch across the clipboard, reducing his inner war to medical shorthand. He said nothing of the tapes. He said nothing of Carter's scream still echoing in his skull. Some truths, he realized, had to be preserved outside official channels. That night, he recorded again. "They'll say I'm unstable. They already do. But the tapes don't lie. If they take my flight hours, if they take my uniform, if they lock me away, this will remain. Proof, or at least a record." His voice faltered. "But sometimes I wonder if the recorder is capturing me, or if it's feeding me back something else." Weeks blurred. The pile of tapes grew. His wife discovered one by accident, slipped between books on a shelf. She confronted him at the dinner table. Their daughter listening in silence. "Elias, what are these? Why are you whispering to machines instead of talking to us?" He had no answer that would not damn him. He muttered about therapy, about keeping track of thoughts, about stress. But her eyes told him she did not believe. His daughter's silence was worse, a wordless confirmation that he was slipping away from the family he had sworn to protect. That night, he buried the tapes deeper, pried up floorboards, sealed them in a tin box. But even underground, they felt too close. He could sense them while lying in bed, could hear their phantom reels spinning in his mind. The paranoia grew. Once, coming home, he found the study door slightly ajar, though he was certain he had locked it. Papers on the desk shifted. A notebook missing, then returned days later. He told himself it was forgetfulness. But when he played back a recent tape, there was a new voice. Faint, barely audible, threaded under his own. He replayed it until his ears ached. A whisper not his. A pattern in static. Angles folded into sound. Aligned, it said. Or perhaps he only imagined it. Perhaps the word had infected him so deeply that he could no longer tell what came from the outside and what erupted from within. One night, he left the recorder running while he slept. In the morning, he rewound the reel. The first hour was silence. The second, his own restless breathing. Then, midway through the third, the house seemed to shift. Creaks of wood, the sigh of wind. And then, the sound of footsteps. Slow, measured, inside the study. A chair scraped. Pages turned. He sat frozen as he listened to his life being rifled through while he dreamed upstairs. But there had been no break-in, no disturbance. The locks were intact. His wife and daughter swore they heard nothing. He pressed stop. The tape clicked. For the first time, he considered burning them all. But he couldn't, because if he destroyed them, he destroyed the only tether between himself and the impossible truth. And so he kept recording. By the end of that month, the tapes had become more than a chronicle. They were dialogue. He began asking questions into the recorder. Were you? Why me? What does it mean aligned? At first there was only hiss. Then faint replies, not words, not even sounds, but distortions in the noise that suggested shape. The more he listened, the more convinced he became that it was answering, but only in a language he had yet to learn. He no longer felt alone in the study. Even when the house slept, even when the recorder was off, he felt watched. Not by men in dark suits, not by colonels in clean offices, but by the lattice itself, bending to the thin skin of reality, tuning him like an instrument. One evening, he caught himself whispering without the recorder on. He didn't realize it until his wife stood in the doorway, eyes wet. Elias, you're scaring us. He looked at his hands, trembling, and saw the ink stains of countless drawn angles, countless diagrams. He realized he had covered the walls of his study with them, sheet after sheet taped in frantic order, as though he could recreate the lattice from memory. His wife fled in silence. He turned back the machine, pressed record, and whispered, "It won't let me stop." When the investigators finally came again, two men in suits, not officers, not doctors, they asked routine questions. He gave routine answers. They glanced at the study door. He blocked their path with casual conversation. They left without pressing. But that night, when he played back his newest tape, he swore he heard one of their voices layered faintly into the real, distorted warning. They know. And still he recorded. Each night, the red light burned like an ember. Each night, he poured his fear and obsession into reels that spun like prayer wheels. Each night, the silence answered back. The silent tapes had become his gospel, his curse, his only proof. He no longer knew if he was archiving reality or manufacturing it. But when he pressed play, when the hiss filled his ears, when the faint pulses matched his heartbeat, he felt less alone. Terrified, unraveling, but no longer alone, because something was listening, and it had always been listening. The ready room was never meant to feel like a tomb, but that morning it did. For pilots sat hunched over flight logs, pen scratching in mechanical rhythm, eyes fixed on the pages as though the ink itself held them captive. No one spoke. The silence was heavier than the Arctic cold pressing against the walls. Captain Elias Reyes felt it seep into his skin, crawl into his lungs. He wrote his name, the date, the mission number. Nothing more. Nothing of what they had seen. Nothing of Carter. Nothing of the lattice. The silence was a pact. It hadn't been declared aloud. No one had drafted papers or sworn oaths. But the colonel's judgment, the questions of the men in suits, the nervous glances in corridors, they had written the terms. To speak was to invite ruin. To remain silent was survival. So they filled their logs with lies of omission and pretended it was duty. Afterward, Reyes lingered. The others left in quick succession, not looking back. He stared at the chalkboard on the wall, at the faint smear where someone had once sketched a radar anomaly and then erased it. A ghost of geometry remained, chalk dust clinging stubbornly. He reached for the eraser, but stopped. The trace was reminder enough. Proof that others had seen. Proof they had chosen to bury. That night, he recorded again, whispering into the machine. We all know. We all saw. And yet, we will all pretend we didn't. That's the only way we can keep flying. The only way we can keep our lives intact. The pact is silence. But silence is a lie, and lies rot everything. The strain showed. At home, his wife pressing for answers. Elias, what's happening to you? You hardly eat, you don't sleep. Our daughter is afraid of you. He tried to reassure her, but the words fell flat. What comfort could he give? That the men he trusted most had decided to erase reality itself? That the world she thought steady was trembling at its foundations? At the base, camaraderie curdled. Pilots avoided each other's eyes. Laughter died quickly in the mess hall. Conversations ended when Reyes walked in. The silence wasn't just in the ready room now. It bled everywhere, binding them tighter than loyalty ever had. One evening, Major Dalton cornered him outside the hangar. Dalton's face was drawn, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. You need to let it go, Elias, he said, voice low. What happened, but if you keep digging, keep whispering into your damn tapes, they'll bury you alive. Reyes bristled. So we just pretend? We let Carter vanish into thin air and pretend it was weather. Dalton's jaw tightened. We don't pretend. We survive. There's a difference. Is there? Reyes snapped. Because it feels the same. Dalton's gaze held his for a long moment, then dropped. Survival's all we've got. The silence became ritual. Each patrol ended with logs scrubbed clean of anomalies. Each briefing reduced to clipped words, sterile data, rehearsed explanations. Carter's name was never spoken. The lattice was never drawn again. Reyes watched men he had trusted for years become strangers wearing familiar faces. He wanted to scream in their silence, to shatter it with the truth. But the colonel's eyes haunted him. The folder marked confidential burned in his memory, and the threat of being grounded forever hung over his head like a blade. And so he wrote his lies, too. Yet silence did not protect him from memory. The lattice followed him into sleep. He dreamed of corridors made of light, of Carter's phantom dissolving, of whispers shaped like geometry. He woke gasping, hands trembling. He turned to the tapes, spilling his fears into their reels. The pact is poison, he murmured. It binds us together, but it hollows us out. We are complicit in our own erasure. Sometimes he wondered if Carter's fate had been the more merciful one. The real fracture came weeks later, during a briefing with younger pilots. One, eager and untested, joked about UFO sightings over the Aleutians. The room froze. Laughter died mid-breath. Every veteran's eyes flicked to Reyes, then away. The silence fell heavier than ever. The younger pilot flushed, confused, and never joked again. Reyes saw in that moment how the pact replicated itself, passed like infection. The truth had not just been buried, it had been engineered out of existence. At home, the pressure mounted. His wife confronted him with trembling hands. She had found his notebooks. Page after page of drawn angles, lattices scribbled in fevered ink. Elias, what is this? What are you doing to yourself? To us. He tried to explain, geometry in the sky, whispers in the static, but the words sounded insane even to his ears. She wept, clutching their daughter, and he realized the silence was consuming more than his squadron. It was consuming his family. Still, he kept recording. Each tape heavier than the last, each confession darker. I'm part of the lie now, he whispered. I sign my name under false reports. I erase Carter with my own hand. That makes me complicit. That makes me theirs. But the static seemed to answer, pulsing with faint rhythms. Not denial, not comfort, just the same word he could never escape. Aligned. By the time the next patrol orders came, Reyes no longer trusted the sky, the base, or himself. Yet he climbed into the cockpit because silence demanded it. He took off into the night, surrounded by men who would never speak of what they saw, who would carry their pack to the grave if necessary. And above them, faint and waiting, the lattice flickered. Not gone, never gone, patient, watching, listening. The mirror in the locker room was nothing but glass and silver backing, no different from any other. Yet it terrified Captain Elias Reyes more than the black void over Alaska. After weeks of silence, of false reports, of tapes that whispered back, he began to fear not the sky above, but the reflection that stared back at him. That morning, he stood alone in the locker room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. He had finished his physical exam, another round of medical charades meant to prove he was fit for duty. He gripped the sink, bent forward, and raised his head slowly to meet his own eyes. Bloodshot, pale, unshaven, he looked like a man unraveling. But what made his chest seize was not the fatigue. It was a faint glow just behind him. For a fraction of a second, in the glass, he saw lines, angles, the lattice. He spun around. Nothing, only empty benches, lockers, and the hum of ventilation. He leaned forward again, heart pounding. The reflection stared back, but it was no longer just his face. There were fractures, tiny distortions in the glass, as though another geometry was trying to bleed through. The reflection's lips moved half a beat behind his own. Aligned, it whispered. Reyes staggered back, his shoulders slamming into a locker. The sound echoed too loud in the hollow room. He pressed his palms over his eyes, whispering, "No, no, you're not real." But when he lowered his hands, the mirror only showed him, red-eyed, terrified, trembling. And yet, he could not shake the certainty that something else had looked out through his skin. That night, he recorded again. His voice was strained, close to breaking. "It's in me now. I saw it in the glass. It's not just in the sky, not just in the tapes. It's behind my face. If I disappear, if I dissolve like Carter, it won't be into nothing. It will be into it. The lattice." He slammed the stop button, the tape clicking too loud, like a gunshot in the quiet. The hallucinations or intrusions, as he began to call them, multiplied. In the shower, steam condensed on the tiles in patterns not random but deliberate, angles intersecting. At night, headlights passing his house bent, refracted, as though folding around invisible structures. In the base cafeteria, the stainless steel trays flickered with reflections of corridors that did not exist. He stopped telling anyone. His wife had grown brittle with fear, his daughters eyes wide with silent confusion. His fellow pilots were prisoners of their pact of silence. Only the tapes received his confessions. Only the reels spun faithfully, capturing his dissent. The breaking point came during a medical evaluation. The psychiatrist asked bland questions, pen scratching on paper. Reyes answered with rehearsed lies until the doctor leaned forward and said, "When you look at yourself, Captain, do you still recognize the man in the mirror?" Reyes froze. His breath caught. He stared at the doctor, searching his face for mockery or menace. But the man's expression was neutral, professional. Still, the words cut too close. He saw again the reflection's lips moving out of sync, heard again the whisper of alignment. He stammered something about stress, about poor sleep. The doctor wrote something down. The session ended. But the question remained. The mirror became an enemy. He avoided it when he could, shaved in haste, washed his face without raising his eyes. But avoidance was not escape. The lattice did not need glass. It began appearing in his dreams. He dreamed of infinite corridors of light, his reflection walking beside him, always half a step out of rhythm. Sometimes the reflection turned its head when he did not. Sometimes it smiled when his own lips remained still. And always it whispered the word he could not outrun. Aligned. One night, he smashed a mirror in his study. His wife found him amidst shards scattered like ice, blood running from his knuckles. She screamed, begged him to stop. He swore the reflection had moved on its own. She did not believe. How could she? He barely believed himself. But the shards on the floor still glowed faintly in his memory, as though geometry had seeped into them. He recorded again, hand bandaged, voice hoarse. The mirror doesn't lie. It shows what's beneath. And what's beneath isn't me anymore. It's something else. Something watching through me. Maybe Carter didn't disappear. Maybe Carter is watching through someone else's eyes right now. He rewound the tape. In the hiss between words, he thought he heard two voices layered together, his own and another fainter, speaking at the same time. For the first time, he considered that the tapes weren't just capturing his descent. They were capturing both sides of the mirror. By the end of that week, Reyes could no longer separate reflection from reality. In the locker room, in shop windows, in the black gloss of the Phantom's canopy, he saw not himself but a man dissolving into geometry. And he knew with terrible certainty that one day soon, the reflection would stop waiting and step forward. That when he reached the sink, when he leaned toward the glass, it would not be his face staring back, but the lattice itself, smiling with his mouth. The ready room was empty when Captain Elias Reyes entered, the echo of his boots bouncing off concrete walls. He had come back late, long after debriefs had ended, long after the corridors had emptied of chatter. He told himself he was there to retrieve a misplaced logbook, but the truth was simpler and darker. He could not stand being at home, not with mirrors that whispered, not with a wife who had begun to flinch at his touch, not with a daughter who watched him as if waiting for him to vanish. The overhead light hummed, harsh and lonely, casting a sterile cone onto the single desk in the center of the room. On it lay a folder, thin, manila, out of place. Reyes stopped short. He scanned the room, lockers shut, chalkboard erased, chairs pushed neatly under tables. Everything sterile, except for the folder. He approached slowly, each step measured, as though proximity might trigger some hidden alarm. When he reached the desk, he saw the label on the tab, Radar Anomalies. His mouth went dry. He opened it with trembling hands. Inside were photocopied graphs, blurred to the point of near abstraction. Jagged lines leapt and dipped across axes marked with dates and times. His eyes caught on one in particular. The dates circled in red. The night Carter vanished. Reyes' knees nearly buckled. He dropped into the chair and stared at the page. The radar trace wasn't noise. It wasn't weather. It was geometry. Sharp, impossible, repeating. Shapes that no natural phenomenon could produce. Shapes he had seen etched in the sky, glowing cold and infinite. A note scrawled at the bottom in a hand he did not recognize. Subject in resonance. His breath quickened. He flipped through the pages. Each one was worse. Patrol logs rewritten, redacted. Transcripts truncated. Audio spectrograms annotated with words that chilled him. Alignment, interference, non-local. These were not the notes of skeptics. These were the notes of believers, of observers cataloging something they could not deny but could not admit publicly. At the back of the folder, a single photograph. Grainy, black and white. A phantom caught mid-flight, wings blurred with motion. And behind it, faint but undeniable, a lattice of light. The geometry frozen in time, faint but there. He gasped and nearly dropped it. His eyes watered, not from the harsh overhead lamp, but from the confirmation. Someone else had seen. Someone else had preserved it. He whispered aloud, though no one was there, "I'm not insane." The words echoed off the cinder block walls like mockery. But then the weight of it hit him. If this dossier existed, it meant he wasn't alone. But it also meant the silence around him wasn't ignorance. It was deliberate. Someone higher up already knew. Someone had compiled the evidence, circled the date, stamped the reports. And yet they had forced him and every other pilot into silence. Why leave the folder for him? A mistake? A warning? A test? He stuffed the pages back inside, his hands slick with sweat. He glanced around again, half expecting officers in dark suits to burst through the door. But the hallway remained quiet. The base slumbered. He pressed the folder to his chest and whispered, "Proof." That night, he locked the dossier in his study, beneath the same floorboards that hid his tapes. He sat cross-legged above it, as though guarding it with his body, recorder running. "I found it," he whispered. "The file. They know. They've always known." They circled the date. Carter was an accident. He was resonance, subject in resonance. His voice cracked. "And so am I." He rewound the tape and listened, just to hear himself say it again. But when the words replayed, they were distorted, doubled, as though another voice had spoken in unison with his own. Not echo, not malfunction. Harmony, aligned. The following morning, the folder was gone. He tore apart the study, ripping up floorboards, scattering tapes and notebooks. His wife screamed at him. His daughter cried. He ignored them, frantic, clawing through splinters and dust. Nothing. No dossier. No graphs. No photograph. Only emptiness where proof had been. He collapsed on the floor, chest heaving, tears stinging his eyes. His wife knelt beside him, hands trembling. "Elias, what are you doing to us?" He could not answer. He could only whisper, hoarse and broken. It was real. Later that day, he was called back into Harrington's office. The colonel's expression was unreadable, carved from the same stone as always. A folder lay on his desk, not the one Reyes had found. A different one, this one thick. Official, stamped again, confidential. Harrington tapped it once with a blunt finger. "Pilot evaluations. Your name is on more pages than I care to count." His gaze sharpened. "Tell me, Captain, do you know what obsession looks like on paper?" Reyes forced himself to meet his eyes. "It looks like truth." For the first time, the colonel's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "No, it looks like instability. And instability grounds pilots." He slid the folder aside. "You're dismissed." That night, Reyes whispered into his recorder again. "They took it back. They left it for me, then took it away." "Why? To see what I do? To prove they can?" The silence is worse than denial. It's control. They erase. They manipulate. They decide what remains. But I saw it. I touched it. And I won't forget. He stared at the recorder's red light until his eyes burned. Then, faintly, through the hiss of static, came a pulse. Slow, deliberate, the same rhythm he had traced on the graphs, the same geometry he had seen in the lattice. He pressed his palms against his ears, but the pulse remained, not in the room, inside him, aligned. The motel room smelled of bleach and loneliness. Captain Elias Reyes had not told his wife where he was going. He had simply packed a bag, driven 3 hours south along snow-choked highways, and checked into a roadside motel whose neon sign buzzed in and out of life. The desk clerk barely looked at him. That anonymity was the point. Here, far from the base, far from his study and the tapes, he thought he might find quiet. Instead, he found the message. It began as restlessness. He lay on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to hum of the heater, the drip of melting ice outside. Sleep refused him. He rose, turned on the desk lamp, and opened the leather-bound logbook he carried everywhere now. Its pages were already cluttered with sketches of lattices, with fragments of Carter's last transmissions, with notes he could never show anyone. He stared at the blank page and felt the recorder heavy in his pocket. He pulled it out, pressed record, whispered, "Tell me what you want." Static, the hiss of empty tape. He almost laughed at himself until the pen in his hand moved. Not by his will, not entirely. His fingers cramped, his wrists locked, and the pen scrawled across the paper in jerks and loops. He tried to stop. He could not. When at last he pulled free, sweat dripping down his temple, he stared at the page. 3 words glowed faintly against the yellow paper. "You are not alone." The glow faded. The words remained, black ink carved deep into the fibers. He stumbled back, chair legs scraping against linoleum. His chest heaved. The recorder still hissed on the desk. He snatched it, rewound, pressed play. His own voice came first, trembling. "Tell me what you want." Then silence. Then faint, almost inaudible, an answering whisper. Not his, Not human. Aligned. He dropped the recorder as though it had burned him. All night he circled the logbook, unable to look directly at the words, yet unable to look away. He told himself it was a hallucination, stress, exhaustion. But the ink was real. The grooves carved into the page were real. He ran his finger over them again and again, half in terror, half in reverence. At dawn, he left the motel and drove aimlessly until the sun rose pale over mountains. He told himself he would burn the page, destroy the book. Yet when he stopped at a diner and opened the logbook, the words were still there. You are not alone. He closed it carefully, as though it were sacred scripture. Back at the base, the silence of the pack pressed heavier than ever. Pilots avoided his gaze. The colonel's stare tracked him like a rifle sight. He went through the motions, checklists, briefings, signatures. But every time he touched pen to paper, he felt a tremor in his wrist, as though waiting for another message to seize him. That night, in his study, he whispered into the recorder again. You've spoken once. Speak again. Tell me why. He waited. Static. Nothing. He slumped in despair. But when he flipped open a logbook, a new mark waited. A series of lines intersecting, forming a crude lattice. The same geometry. He stopped eating. Stopped sleeping. His wife begged him to see a doctor. His daughter left drawings on his desk. Childish sons in houses meant to pull him back. But he pushed them aside. The logbook consumed him. Each day new marks appeared. Angles, circles, cryptic words. Sometimes they glowed faintly before fading into ordinary ink. Sometimes they bled through multiple pages, as though pressed by a hand stronger than his own. One night, after hours of waiting, he watched in awe as the pen lifted on its own. Slowly, gracefully, it traced letters across the page. His hands trembled as he read. Carter is aligned. He gasped, slammed the book shut, and backed into the wall. His chest convulsed with sobs he could not contain. Carter, his wingman, not dead, not gone, aligned. The next day, he confronted Dalton, cornered him in the hangar, thrust the logbook into his hands. Read it, Reyes demanded. See for yourself. Dalton glanced at the page. Blank. He frowned. What am I supposed to see? Reyes grabbed it back, frantic. The words were there. He saw them, sharp and undeniable. But Dalton only shook his head. You need help, Elias. More than I can give. Reyes stared in horror. The messages were meant only for him. That night, the logbook gave him another sentence. You are next. His blood ran cold. He stared at the words until dawn, unable to decide if they were threat or promise. The sentence would not fade. You are next sat there in a logbook with the obstinacy of a stamped order, the kind that doesn't travel by memo, but by courier and gun. Captain Elias Reyes stared at it until the paper blurred, until the black letters swam like oil on water, until he caught himself mouthing the words in a rhythm that was not his own. He shut the book. He opened it. He shut it again. The letters remained with the calm of a verdict. He did what pilots do when the sky starts lying. He built a checklist. He opened his second desk drawer, the one he never used because it stuck, pried it free with a grunt, and laid out the contraband life he had assembled in the months since Carter. The cassettes, each labeled in his cramped block caps, 3 photocopies of radar screens he shouldn't have, a Polaroid of the locker room mirror after he'd smashed it, tiny prisms of glass catching a light that had not been in the room, a pencil stub, a church key, a stopwatch. He clicked the stopwatch. It stuttered and stopped without moving. The hairs on his forearms lifted. He set it down with the care one gives a live round. Then he opened a new cassette, wrote forbidden notes on the label, and pressed record. This is Captain Elias Reyes, he whispered. Personal log 16. If anyone hears this who is not me, if there is still me to hear it, know that I did not go looking for what spoke to me. It chose the sky. It chose Carter. Now it's choosing me. I am trying to leave a path. He described the logbook message. The way the pen had lifted on its own the night before. The way the word aligned had come to mean more than obedience. As if alignment were a position in a machine, a tooth on a gear, a slot into which a human life could be pressed and made to turn. He stopped the tape, and listened to house. The refrigerator coughed 2 rooms over. The heater breathed. Beyond those domestic sounds, silence should have been innocent. It felt occupied. He pressed record again. New protocols, he said, forcing the words into the narrow groove a checklist provides. 1. No mirrors. 2. No writing without my hands on the pen and my eyes on the page. 3. No tapes left running while I sleep. 4. The logbook stays with me, or it goes in the ground. 5. He couldn't make 5. His throat closed. He set the recorder down and pressed his palms over his eyes until tiny white lattices burst in the darkness. When he opened them, the room was ordinary again. The green lampshade, the pile of laundry, the photo of his daughter in a frame she glued with seashells from a summer it felt obscene to remember. He dug a shoebox from the back of the closet, nested the cassettes inside 2 layers of folded sweaters, slid the logbook in with them, and walked out into the cold. The yard was a white sheet on a table no one had bothered to set. Pines leaned like old men in overcoats. He crossed the spot at the fence where the snow drift always crusted first, knelt, and began to dig with a flat spade. Each scoop rasped. His breath hung around his face like something trying to escape. He dug until his hands ached and his shoulders burned. When he had a hole deep enough to hide his shoebox and sin, he slid the box in and said, because he had to say something, "Stay." Then he filled the hole. He tamped it with the spade. He smoothed it with his palm. Only when the ground looked unremarkable did he allow himself to stand. On his way back to the door, he felt it, the pressure, that old conductive hum in the bones. He turned. Nothing moved. The pines kept their counsel. The sky above the base's glow was a dark plate, but the pressure climbed his spine like you climb a ladder you didn't know you owned. Not tonight, he said to the air, low and ridiculous. Not here. He went inside. He locked the door. He placed the spade beside the frame with the seashells and stared at the juxtaposition until he hated himself for the superstition. That night, he slept for an hour and dreamed for 8. The dream was not a narrative. It was a corridor, a cold-blued hallway with walls of light, every seam cut so precisely you could shave with it. He was barefoot. His footfalls made no sound. He tried to turn around. There was no around. Ahead, the corridor opened into a chamber as large as the sky. Suspended within it, machines. Not engines, not turbines, conditions, sculptures of necessity. Every angle was both equation and command. He woke chewing air. The clock read 3:17. He sat up. The house was black, except for the line of light under the study door. He hadn't left the study light on. He held still. The hum, not electricity, but of attention, was strongest at the back of his neck now. He walked barefoot down the hall, each step deliberate, as if tiptoeing through a story that would punish any noise. He put his hand on the doorknob. Cold, but not metal cold. Space cold. The kind of cold that lives where nothing rubs against anything long enough to make heat. He opened the door. The lamp was on. The desk was orderly. The chair sat where he'd left it. On the blotter, the logbook lay open. He hadn't dug up the shoebox. He knew that the way you know your own name. He crossed the room and leaned over the book. The page was blank. He closed it and saw dirt under binding. He flipped to the back. A handful of granules fell to the blotter. Soil. Fresh. He flipped to the center. Words he hadn't written lay there in a hand that mimicked as only enough to shame him. You will be moved. He rocked back, the chair leg skittering. He slammed the book shut, crushing the sentence as if it were an insect. He turned in a circle that made no sense to any observer except the one thing observing. The shelves, the lamp, the spade. He had not brought the spade into the study. He stared at it. A thread of meltwater ran down the shaft and fell onto the rug. A dark spot spread. The phone rang. The normal sound of a normal phone in a normal house hit him like a command to breathe. He snatched the receiver. Reyes. Captain. Colonel Harrington's voice carried the fatigue of a man who does not believe in the supernatural but has learned to budget for it. You're to report to the hangar at 0500. No flight. Inspection. Sir, it's 3 in the morning. 0500, Harrington said and hung up. Reyes looked at the rug again. The dark spot had become a line. The melt was writing. He didn't sleep. The hangar at dawn is a church whose congregants carry wrenches. Floodlights painted the Phantom's fuselage with a shine you could shave in. A crew chief raised a chin at Reyes in the ancient liturgy of men who share ownership of a machine. Harrington stood under the wing with a clipboard and a face that promised nothing and delivered less. "Walk her with me," the colonel said. They circled the jet. Harrington touched rivets as if counting beads. He asked mechanical questions Reyes could answer sleep. They were half a fusillade from the nose when Harrington stopped and placed a clipboard on a crate. "Captain." "Sir, do you know what the word containment means outside a dictionary?" Reyes kept his eyes on the tire's sidewall, so he wouldn't have to keep them on the man. "Yes, sir. The institution can contain a phenomenon it does not understand in 3 ways, Harrington said, voice low. By denying it, by quarantining those who witnessed it, or by learning its boundaries. Reyes said nothing. "We have tried the first 2, Harrington went on. "Poor results. The 3rd is above my pay grade. It is above yours. But I am not blind." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a photocopy, the blurred black and white of a lattice behind a plane. He held it up so it caught the hangar light. "This exists because someone smarter than me wanted it to." Reyes' throat tightened. "Then why ground me? Why the charades? Why send me to talk to men with clipboards until I stop making sense?" "Because a man who believes he is watched is easier to predict than a man who believes he is free." Harrington slid the copy back into his pocket. "And because men disappear, Captain. Some into water, some into reports. I'm doing what I can to keep you in neither." "What you can do," Reyes said, the restraint he'd spent months rationing finally snapping, "is stop calling what took Carter phenomenon. It spoke. It writes in my house. It digs up what I bury." Harrington's jaw worked once, a muscle-learning humility. "Bring me what you have." "I have nothing," Reyes said, and heard in his own voice of defeat that makes good men old. "It comes when it wants. It leaves when it wants. And it's leaving messages now. In me. To me." "Messages," Harrington said, the word too small in his mouth. Reyes nodded. "He did not say you are next. He did not say you will be moved. He did not say Carter is aligned. He said carefully, 'Notes I didn't write.'" Harrington watched him a long time, then did something Reyes did not anticipate. He looked afraid. Not of disclosure, not of scandal. Of miscalculation. "At 0900, the colonel said, you will meet 2 civilians in Building 7. You will answer only what is asked. You will not lie. You will not volunteer. Afterward, you will go home. You will not sleep at home." "Sir, get a room off base," Harrington said. "Not the motel with the buzzing sign. A different one. Pay cash. Do not use your name." He looked up at the Phantom's intake, as if it could suck this entire conversation into a place where jet wash burns secrets clean. "If there is such a thing as alignment, Captain, the very least you can do is make it work to your advantage. Be somewhere else when the next set of hands reaches for you." Reyes felt the entirely inappropriate urge to laugh. "You think it uses doors?" "I don't think," Harrington said. "I budget." He picked up the clipboard. 0900. The civilians in Building 7 wore the same suit with 2 different men in it. They asked patient questions no human conversation has ever needed. "When you say inside, do you mean inside the cockpit, inside your auditory cortex, inside your expectation of sound? When you say aligned, do you mean oriented or consented?" Reyes answered the way you disarm a mind you know is real, slowly, with no sudden moves. He watched their eyes when he said writing. He watched their pens when he said logbook. He watched their throats when he said Carter. The eyes narrowed, the pens slowed, the throats worked. These were men who had flown desks through 3 administrations and learned that the most survivable posture is the one that looks like curiosity. When they finished, one of them put a manila envelope on the table and placed his palm on it the way a chaplain does a Bible. "This is for you," the man said. "Do not open it here." Reyes slid it into his jacket and did not let his face ask the questions his mouth knew better than a voice. He left the base by the back gate. He drove a road salted white, then turned onto a road not on any map a clerk at the base exchange would recognize. He stopped at a lodge that had once believed it would be fashionable and now believed it would at least remain standing. He paid in cash. He gave a name from a war no one had drafted him into. He took the end room and set the envelope on the table as if it were heavy. He turned the TV on for cover and the volume down for mercy. He opened the envelope. Inside, a single photocopy. Not radar, not photograph. A page from a manual that had never been printed. Title, Project Sentinel, Contact Protocols Draft. The typewriter font had the misaligned consonants of a machine that had typed orders into wars. He read, when addressed, do not answer in kind. Human syntax will be interpreted as consent to configuration. Do not isolate the addressed individual. Solitude is a multiplier. Recordings made in proximity to address are not neutral artifacts. Treat them as surfaces. If alignment begins, introduce noise, human noise, music, language, breath. The machine respects only rhythms it makes. Teach the room to prefer yours. At the bottom, a single handwritten line in a woman's hand. If you can bury it, it's already with you. His scalp prickled. He remembered the soil on his blotter, the melt on his rug, the log book open when it should have been underground. He shut the TV off. The room got very large. He put his ear to the wall and listened. A couple was arguing 2 rooms over about money and fidelity, and whether a man who leaves his socks on the floor deserves to be left with nothing. Their voices were humanly inelegant, full of breath and interruption. Reyes had never heard anything so beautiful. He turned the cassette recorder on and set it between himself and the wall. He pressed record and did not speak. He let their human noise pour into his tape, the stumbles, the swears, the laughter that comes after a cry you didn't think your body could make. He recorded half an hour of people being people, and then clicked stop. Sentinel, he said to the empty lodge room. Teach the room to prefer mine. He played the tape back. On the first pass, he heard only them. On the second, beneath them, a faint lattice, like someone had drawn graph paper under a love letter. On the third, the lattice miscounted, fell out of rhythm, and faded. He slept in his clothes on top of the covers with the recorder on his chest like a relic. He dreamed of nothing he could remember. In the morning, he called Laura from the payphone by the ice machine. He didn't say, I hurt you. He didn't say, I am trying to rescue us from something that does not believe in rescue. He said, I'm safe, and meant it for the first time in weeks. He bought coffee that tasted like the underside of a truck and drank it like a sacrament. He put the Sentinel page back in the envelope, and the envelope in the lining of his jacket, where a tailor had once hidden a cigarette for a wedding he hadn't attended. On the way back to the base, he stopped at a hardware store and bought 4 small radios, the kind you clip to a belt to feel necessary. He tuned them to different stations. A preacher, a call-in show about tires, a station that played Hank Williams with the fidelity of on a string, a frequency that belonged to no one, but always had someone on it anyway. He put one in his kitchen, one in his daughter's room, one in his study, and one in his car. When his wife raised her eyebrows, he said, the house is too quiet. When his daughter laughed and asked if they were bugs, he said, only the kind we invite. That night, he did not open the logbook. He put it under the mattress at the foot of the bed like contraband adolescents. He sat in the study with the radio muttering about carburetors and grace, about coupon codes and sin, and he recorded nothing but that. At 2:11, the study lamp flickered and steadied. The radio hiccuped and found its station again by sound alone. The lattice did not enter the room so much as find it already occupied. Not tonight, Reyes said again, and felt ridiculous again, and was grateful to feel anything. The next morning, the logbook had a new line in a thin, slanted hand. He didn't recognize and recognized all the same. Noise is resistance. He underlined it twice with a pen that stayed where he put it. On the base, Harrington called him into the office and told him nothing useful and everything true in one sentence. They want you quiet, but I want you loud in the right places. He slid a small object across the desk. It was a key stamped with the number 17. Locker? Reyes asked. Basement, Harrington said. Old comms vault. You'll find a repeater and 2 coils and a manual that lies. Make them tell the truth. Why me? Because you're the one it wrote to, Harrington said, and for a moment the man looked like a father who knows enough to know he cannot save his son and will try anyway. In the vault, Reyes found equipment the base had forgotten and the project had remembered. He ran coax like a contraband river. He tuned coils with a dentist's patience. He fed 2 radios with 1 signal, and then the reverse. He played the argument from the lodge into the repeater and watched the spectrum dance. He whistled. He cussed. He laughed at himself, and then at nothing, and then at something, when he keyed the mic and said, low and clear, "This room prefers human." The needle on a meter wavered and settled. He went home before dark. He ate a whole dinner. He read to his daughter and did voices badly on purpose. He touched his wife's wrist and did not flinch when she did not flinch. At midnight, the logbook wrote 1 word in the bottom corner of a page he had not opened. Noted. He slept on purpose and dreamed of a hangar in which machines were not conditions but tools again, and of a corridor whose door stayed closed because a radio on the floor was telling a joke only a human could love. In the morning, the stopwatch on his desk started on its own and kept time. He picked it up, weighed it in his palm, clicked it with his thumb, and smiled when it obeyed. Under the smile, under the noise, under the stubbornness that makes a man lash a line to his own mast, he knew the truth the Sentinel page could not print. Notes like his are not forbidden because they are dangerous to the public. They are forbidden because they teach the address to answer with a different grammar. And grammar is how a universe decides what it permits. He wrote in the logbook, his hand, his ink, his heat, "If you're going to move me, you will carry more than my body." The page did not glow. It did not reply. Somewhere above the base, blue-white angles unlearned a step they had been certain of and waited for a song. The world after the message no longer behaved like the world before. Captain Elias Reyes had lived his life inside frameworks of certainty. Flight plans, coordinates, fuel ratios, protocols, discipline. Every maneuver had a checklist, every decision a hierarchy. Yet now the structures of reality itself seemed to flex like glass under heat. He had written down "you are next" in his logbook, and ever since moments bent, seconds folded, events aligned with impossible anticipation. It began with a red light. He had been driving back from the base, exhausted, eyes burning from another sleepless night spent staring at the logbook. His wife had stopped calling. His daughter no longer left drawings. Silence hung heavier than reprimands. The road ahead was slick with melted snow, the yellow lines blurring under the wash of headlights. At an intersection, he eased his foot onto the brake. The light above still shone green. Yet something inside him twisted, a silent pulse that urged him to stop. Against instinct, against logic, he slammed the brakes. The car lurched. At that same instant, a semi-truck barreled through the red light of the cross street, air horn blaring, headlights splitting the night. The truck would have cut him in half. Reyes sat frozen, sweat soaking his collar. His hand shook on the wheel. His mind whispered what his mouth could not. He had known. The episodes multiplied. During a flight check, his hand darted to a failing gauge before the warning light even blinked. In the commissary, he caught a falling tray before it slipped from a young airman's grip. At night, dreams place him inside corridors of light, showing him paths through days not yet lived. He woke gasping, only to walk into the exact scenes hours later. Words spoken, doors opened, silences timed to the second. At first, he tried to tell himself it was sharpened instinct, the residue of years in cockpits where survival demanded speed. But he knew better. These were not reflexes. They were alignments. The lattice was not merely outside him now. It was within. Dalton noticed first. "You move before you should," the major muttered one night at the bar, swirling whiskey but not drinking. "Like the game's already been played and you're just acting it out." Reyes stared at him, the words chilling because they felt true. He tried to laugh it off, but Dalton's eyes were grave. Careful, Dalton added. "They don't want a man who sees the moves before they're made. They want obedience, not resonance." Reyes said nothing, but he went home shaken, the logbook heavier in his bag. The next test came in the skies. Scramble order late at night. A radar blip too fast, too high, too erratic to be dismissed as weather. Reyes strapped into the Phantom, the cockpit familiar but colder than ever. The canopy reflected his pale face, eyes ringed with shadows. The AWACS voice crackled. Vector 310. Investigate. He banked toward the shimmer already visible before the instruments caught it. A glow, faint and geometric, sliding parallel with his jet like a ghost. His pulse raced, but not with fear, with recognition. His hand tightened on the yoke. He knew where it would turn before it moved. He rolled ahead of it, matching its path. The radio filled with frantic voices. How the hell is he anticipating it? The shimmer pulsed, brightened, then faded into the void. Reyes steadied the jet, breath ragged, knowing he had just flown not against the unknown, but alongside it. On the ground, the consequences arrived swiftly. Harrington summoned him. The colonel's office was darker than usual, blinds drawn. On the desk, a folder-stamped medical review. Your reflexes are off the charts, Harrington said flatly. Your anticipation borders on precognition. The reports don't say that. Of course. They use words like instinct and hypervigilance. But we both know what this really is. Reyes swallowed. Alignment. The colonel's eyes hardened. Don't ever say that word here. He leaned forward. Do you understand, Captain? The moment you stop being a pilot and become a phenomenon, you're no longer useful. You're a liability. Reyes said nothing. He left the office with his fists clenched so tightly his nails cut skin. The logbook grew stranger. No longer did it wait for his hand. Some nights. The pages turned themselves, corners lifting in still air. Diagrams spread across multiple sheets, unfolding like blueprints. Not just lattices, but machines, vast engines, corridors lined with geometry, conduits glowing. He traced them with trembling fingers, unable to comprehend yet unable to look away. One night, 3 words etched themselves into the paper as he watched. You are chosen. He slammed the book shut, terror and awe battling inside him. The changes inside him deepened. Lights flickered when he entered rooms. Radios hissed into static when he passed. The pulse he had once felt only in the lattice now thrummed in his veins, a heartbeat not entirely his own. He stood in front of the mirror one dawn, gripping the sink, staring at his reflection. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot. But behind them, faint geometric lines shimmered, as though etched into the whites. He blinked. They faded. He leaned closer. They returned. He smashed the mirror with his fist. Glass fell like frozen rain. His knuckles bled, but the reflection that stared back from a shar on the floor was smiling faintly, though he was not. Dalton cornered him again days later. They're watching you, he hissed. More than usual. Files, cameras, the works. I don't know what you did up there, but they think you've crossed over. Reyes whispered, Maybe I have. Dalton recoiled. Don't say that. Don't even think it. Once you're theirs, whether it's brass or whatever's in the sky, you're done being human. Reyes wanted to argue, but deep down he feared Dalton was right. The proof came when the recorder betrayed him. He played back a night's whispering, only to hear not his own voice but Carter's, his dead wingman, faint, warped, but undeniable. Aligned, aligned, aligned. The word repeated until the tape distorted, shrieking with feedback. Reyes tore the cassette apart with bare hands. Yet even without the tape, the word echoed in his skull. The last straw came on the highway again. Driving home at dusk, he slowed suddenly, instinct screaming. A deer bolted across the road at that exact instant. He hadn't seen it. Couldn't have. Yet he stopped anyway. When he pulled over, chest heaving, he realized something terrifying. He was no longer surprised. Anticipation had become expectation. The lattice was not just guiding him. It was inhabiting him. He pressed his palms to the wheel, whispering, What might be coming? The hum of the dashboard answered with faint static. Then, impossibly, the radio crackled though it was off. A whisper electric, alien yet intimate. Conductor. That night, he opened the logbook one last time. Every page blazed with light. Words scrawled themselves faster than his eyes could track. Diagrams unfolded like living things. And in the center of it all, one sentence pulsed, glowing brighter than the rest. You are no longer alone. Reyes fell to his knees, clutching the book, tears burning his cheeks. He felt the pulse in his veins sync with the rhythm on the page. His heart, his breath, the geometry, all one. The altered man knelt in silence, no longer asking what it meant. He knew. The envelope waited on the motel desk like an animal that knew it was being watched. Reyes had chosen a different motel this time. Harrington's advice followed to the letter. No buzzing neon, no clerk who recognized his face, no credit card trail. He paid cash, signed the register as E. Raymond, and took the end room where the ice machine's irregular clatter could pass for company. He locked the door, drew the curtains, and set the envelope down with the care you give to objects that look too light for what they contain. Manila unsealed, no markings on the outside. The weight of a few sheets of paper, nothing more. But as he sat on the bed and listened to the heater rattle, he felt the pressure, familiar now, crawl up his spine and settle in a notch at the base of his skull. Not a presence, an expectation. Alignment brushing his edges, reminding him that the room's air was shared between him, and a geometry that did not require doors. He slit the flap with his thumbnail and slid the papers out. The first page carried a heading typed in a font that belonged to a government that pretended paper could keep secrets. Subject in resonance. Preliminary observations. Below that, a name he recognized and hated to see on anything official. Capped, Elias Reyes, USAF. On the right margin, stamped in red, medical review. Underneath, in a second stamp, colder, special case. His mouth went dry. He read, subject demonstrates anticipatory behaviors inconsistent with standard flight training, ref. Sortie 7 to 310. Not predictive in the statistical sense. Behavior suggests coupling with unknown external signal. Alignment, a term introduced by subject, see log extracts. Phenomenon not repeatable on demand, but observed in multiple environments. Air, ground, domestic. There were bullet points, clinical and obscene in their confidence. Mirror response anomaly documented, photographic evidence withheld. See Annex C. Oral phenomena present in subject proximity, even without device mediation. See Sentinel memo. Familial strain increasing, isolation risk high. Isolation correlates with deeper resonance, project Sentinel recommendation. Introduce noise, human noise. The paragraph that followed was a knife. Recommendation. Do not isolate subject. Do not discredit. Contain via participation. Assign to structured routine with supervised variability. Reinforce bonds through human noise. Permit off-base lodging under supervision to minimize domestic collapse. Goal is not cure. Goal is boundary. He turned the page with fingers that felt borrowed. The second sheet was an excerpt, typed lines that had been photocopied so many times the letters bled. Project Sentinel, Addendum 4. Address learns the subject's grammar faster than the subject learns the addresses. Language exposure must be human dominant. Speech, song, argument, laughter. Recordings degrade into surfaces. Do not trust them. If subject begins to anticipate anomalies, motor preemption, knowing, do not punish. Punishment increases resonance. Redirect into tasks with human cadence. Cooking, driving in traffic. Conversation that interrupts itself. In the margin, a handwritten note in a neat, tight script. He's already there. If we push, he tips. He stared at the words until the paper blurred again. He's already there. There where? With what? The room seemed to tilt, not physically but grammatically. Sentences he knew how to live by drifted out of reach. He set the papers aside and pressed his palms to his eyes. When he looked again, a third sheet waited at the bottom of the stack. It was not a memo. It was a scan of a page from a log he recognized, not his own, not Dalton's. The top bore the imprint of a different base, a different year. Duly AFB, FLT log restricted, 1974. The handwriting was a careful, square print of an officer who expected to be audited by the future. Only 2 lines hadn't been redacted. Lights not craft. Lattice probable. Reyes pattern present. He blinked. Reyes pattern. His name, written before he'd flown a single sortie, before he'd held stick, before he'd kissed Laura under a street lamp and told her he would never bring work home. The date in the corner, November 14th, 74, made the skin at the back of his neck go cold in a way Alaska never could. It wasn't his name, he told himself. It was a pattern named after something else. A researcher, a math term, a coincidence. But the note below the lines killed that escape. It was typed, not handwritten. Reyes pattern. Subject coupled to anticipation. Preemptive motor selection. Uncommon. Dangerous if isolated. He put the paper down because his hands were shaking. The fourth sheet was a photograph, grainy and overexposed. A manila folder's ghost deeper inside a ghost file. A phantom, frozen mid-roll, was etched against a sky that wore the aurora like a bruise. Behind the jet, faint but undeniable, a mesh of blue-white lines rose like scaffolding for the air itself. Underneath, someone had clipped a label with a stapler that bit too hard. Subject in resonance. He didn't breathe for a whole count. When he did, the breath came back with the smell of hot electronics and motel bleach, table laminate, and winter. The last sheet was a simple instruction, typed and underlined. Do not return these pages to any government custodian. If you wish to live a human life, make a human copy, summary, not artifact. Burn the rest. Below it, in that same neat, tight script, a single line. We try to save another. We don't know if we did. He stacked the pages, slid them back into the envelope, and held it in both hands like a church thing. He did not burn it. Not yet. He paced the room, listening to the heater tick as it expanded and the ice machine cough outside like a smoker. He set the envelope down on the table again. Human noise, he said, half to himself, half to the room that listened. He turned the radio on. The dial found a station, giving away tickets to a Thursday night bowling league. He turned the volume up. The DJ's laugh was a relief. So physical, he had to sit down for it. He took out the cassette recorder. He did not press record. He let the music, the ads, the greasy chatter fill the corners of the room that geometry likes, the right angles where silence collects and becomes shape. When he finally slept, he dreamed not of corridors, not of machines, but of Laura's hand dropping a spoon and laughing because a dog tried to steal it. He woke with a wet face and couldn't tell if he cried in the dream or in the room. The men in suits came at noon the next day. They didn't knock like guests, they knocked like owners. 3 quick raps, a wait, then a single heavy insistence. Reyes tucked the envelope under the mattress, wiped his palms on his trousers, and opened the door. Captain. Same suits as Building 7. Same comm. Same eyes that scan a space for recording surfaces as easily as they scan a human face for compliance. Gentlemen, he said, I was about to go out. You're out now, one replied pleasantly. We'll talk in the car. It wasn't a question. He took his jacket and left the radio on. He didn't look back at the envelope because fear makes you obvious and obvious makes you empty. The car was government black and smelled faintly of new plastic over old cigarettes. He sat in the back. One suit took the passenger seat. The driver rolled him onto the road with the careful competence of a man who has never been stopped by anyone he couldn't fire. They didn't speak until they reached the edge of town. Only then did the passenger twist around and say, Do you believe you are being addressed, Captain? Reyes watched the road. The snow had turned to powder, blowing through the light like the ash of burned paper. Yes. By whom? Not whom, he said before he could help himself. What? And what is the wrong word, too? Do you believe you are ill? Reyes thought of the mirror, of the logbook writing itself, of the way a deer had crossed a road and survived because his body knew a second while his mind was still negotiating. Not in the way you mean. Do you want help? I want a boundary. The passenger considered that. Help is a kind of boundary. And a kind of cage. A cage, the passenger said, is just a boundary with bad press. Reyes almost laughed. He didn't. Outside the window, a pickup slipped through an intersection, corrected, and carried on. He imagined the driver's heart thudding and returning to baseline. Imagine a human sigh in a human cab under a human sky. He wanted that more than he wanted sleep. Captain, The passenger said, "There will be a medical review board convened next week. They will stamp something. Fitness or unfitness. Those are their two instruments. They are insufficient to the music you're playing, but they are the instruments we have. What do you want from me?" "Consent." The passenger smiled without warmth, to be contained by participation. Reyes looked at the man until the man looked away. "What if I don't consent?" "Then the same thing happens, but worse." He let the car's heater his fill what he could not. "We'll take you back," the driver said at last. "We left something under your door." They didn't return him to the motel. They returned him to the road that leads to it, and let him out with a nod that said the conversation will continue whether you have it or not. He walked the last 100 yards in the wind. The hallway smelled like detergent pretending to be citrus. Under his door, a white envelope, thinner than a manila, stamped only with a small blue 17. He locked the door, opened the envelope, and slid out a single key on a key ring stamped B, 17. Basement. The motel had no basement. He turned the key in his palm, felt the numbers press the soft meat below his thumb, and remembered Harrington's locker key, the comms vault, the repeater, the coil. 17. Whoever wrote the hand notes on his papers liked that number, or the number liked him. He checked the hallway again, found it empty, lifted the mattress, and took out the manila envelope. He added the white one to it. He looked at both and said aloud, to the geometry and to the men and to his own heart, "I am not a mailbox." The logbook lay where he'd left it on the table, closed. He didn't open it. He took the Sentinel page instead, the one with the typed lines and the handwritten sentence. If you can bury it, it's already with you. He flattened it with his palm and reread the 4 rules. Do not answer in kind. Do not isolate. Recordings or surfaces. Introduce human noise. He turned the radio up. A caller explained, passionately, profanely, why snow tires were a conspiracy. The host laughed until he coughed. It was the most blessed cough Reyes had ever heard. He pressed record and set the cassette deck between the radio and the door. He paced and muttered on purpose about nothing. The color of cheap motel blankets, why light switches always feel colder than doorknobs, how his daughter insisted the dog understood knock-knock jokes. He let language fill the room the way steam fills a mirror, making it briefly too human to reflect anything else. When his voice finally broke, he stopped the tape. The reels clicked. He rewound 10 seconds and pressed play. Static, hiss, chatter, human debris. Underneath, the old pulse. Softer now, further off, as the thing that made it step back to hear better. He slept at the foot of the bed with his shoes on and the key ring in his palm. When he woke at 3, there was a line of letters on the inside of his wrist where the key had pressed all night. B17. He laughed, quietly, because even miracles should be mocked. They convened a medical review board in a windowless room that had never heard a joke. 3 officers, 1 civilian. A recorder with an LED that pretended to be an eye. Reyes stood until told to sit, said sir when required, ma'am when demanded, and yes and no with a care that would have shamed a surgeon. "Captain," the civilian began, "how many hours of sleep do you average per night?" 3 to 5. "Any nightmares?" "I dream," he said, and left the sentence there. "Do you hear voices when no one is present?" "I hear pressure," he said. "Sometimes it is shaped like language." "Do you anticipate events?" "Sometimes I move at the right time," he said, "and I don't know why." "Do you believe you are a danger to yourself or others?" "I believe I am a door other things like to knock on." The board glanced among themselves. A colonel whose shoulders had been square since Korea cleared his throat. "Captain Reyes, the Air Force requires pilots. Pilots require stability. You present an unknown." Reyes waited. "Unknowns don't fly," the colonel said, and looked sorry in a way that made no difference. The civilian leaned forward. "However," she said, "you are not unwell in any way we can write down. Your tests are exemplary. Your body is sound. You have not harmed yourself or others. You have, in fact, avoided harm, repeatedly." A major on the end of the table, medical, the kind of man who carries an anatomy of the heart under the skin of his face, added, "We can ground you indefinitely for evaluation." He said the last word with the weariness of a man who knows evaluation can be a life sentence. Or we can take the colonel's view and find you temporarily fit. Conditional on continued observation, therapy, and compliance. Compliance, the colonel echoed softly, and the word was not a threat, only architecture. The civilian closed a folder. Captain, do you consent to continued observation, therapy, compliance? The room waited. Reyes felt the key in his pocket, metal against cloth, the circle biting his thigh. He felt the pulse at the base of his skull and the cheaper, warmer pulse at his wrist. He felt hunger. He felt anger. He felt the 1974 log note like a hand on his shoulder from a man he'd never meet. I consent, he said, on my terms. The colonel's eyebrow rose half an inch. Which are, I will keep making noise, Reyes said, and didn't care they understood. You will not isolate me. Reasonable, the civilian said. The major looked relieved. The colonel made a mark in a column few men ever get to see. The board stamped something that would decide nothing and everything. Fit conditional. Medical review, continue. Special case, maintain. When Reyes stood to leave, the civilian slid a card toward him as if it were contraband. No name, no agency, only a phone number and the word Sentinel. He didn't take it. Not yet. He put his palm on the table, 5 fingers human, and said, teach your rooms to prefer us. The civilian smiled with her eyes. The colonel didn't understand and didn't try. The major did both and failed and looked grateful for failure. He drove back to the motel with the radio tuned to a station where 2 brothers argued about baseball like it mattered. He parked in front of his door and sat with the car running until the announcer said, we'll be right back, and named 3 sponsors who would never know they'd helped a man outrun a lattice for 10 minutes. When he opened the door, the envelope lay where he'd left it. The key ring B, 17 sat beside it. The logbook, closed, had half an inch across the table. He saw the shift the way you notice a missing tooth, with the tongue. Instinctively, he put the envelope in the sink. He lit a match. He burned the copies he should never have been given and watched the smoke attempt shapes and fail. He turned the faucet on and drowned ash. When the last black petals softened and slid into the drain, he turned the water off and stood very still. He took the logbook outside and set it on the hood of the car. The night was cold enough to hurt. He opened to the middle and wrote, in block letters, like a man building a wall, I consent to human noise. He waited. Nothing wrote back. The sky was indifferent. The geometry, if it was there, kept its peace. A pickup rolled by and a dog barked at nothing. Somewhere inside the motel, a woman laughed like she'd just discovered that laughter still works. He closed the book. He went inside. He slept. When he woke, there was a note slid under the door. Not government stock, not manila, not official. Torn from a legal pad. Handwritten in a cramped, hurried scrawl. Locker B, 17. Tonight, alone. Bring nothing that records. Come back with a boundary. He held the note and smiled despite himself, because it was reckless, because it was human, because even in a world where the air could learn to speak, some conspiracies still needed paper torn by hand. He folded the note twice and tucked it into the Sentinel envelope he hadn't burned. He put the key in his pocket. He put the radio on the dresser and turned it up. An ad jingle about rug shampooers filled the room like a hymn. Then he picked up the logbook and, for the first time since the message you are next, he didn't flinch when the paper touched his hands. On the inside back cover, in letters faint as breath on cold glass, a sentence had appeared while he slept. The boundary is not the wall. It is the song. He underlined it once. He had a basement to find. He had a locker to open. He had a life to try to keep human long enough to matter. He took a breath. He stepped into the day. And far above him, where Aurora lays its veil over machines that are also conditions, something paused, counted, and waited for the room to choose. The road between Anchorage and Fairbanks is a long ribbon of asphalt that knows silence better than it knows traffic. Captain Elias Reyes had driven it dozens of times during his years at Elmendorf. But this time was different. He was not on assignment, not on leave, not on any map the Air Force would ever acknowledge. He was chasing absence itself. The note slid under his motel door, Locker B, 17. Tonight, alone, that still weighed in his pocket, folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft. The key marked B, 17 pressed against his thigh. He did not know where the locker was. He only knew that if he drove, if he kept the radio loud with human noise, the miles would open themselves to him like a corridor. But the corridor he found was not the one he expected. It began with the odometer. At first it was ordinary, digits turning, miles ticking by. He checked compulsively, like a pilot monitoring gauges, because every time he looked he expected something wrong. For the first 100 miles, everything was steady. Then, somewhere between two gas stations, both of which he remembered clearly, both of which sold stale coffee and windshield deicer, the numbers jumped. He blinked. The odometer had leapt forward 63 miles. The gas gauge had not moved. The clock on the dash had not advanced. He pulled to the shoulder, heart pounding, headlights slicing into trees glazed with ice. He stepped out into the cold, breath fogging, and turned in a slow circle. The world was still there. Snow, trees, dark sky cut with faint aurora, the hum of the car engine, the hiss of cooling tires. But his body knew. Something had been folded, skipped, erased. 63 miles of road had not happened. He climbed back in the car and gripped the wheel with trembling hands. Aligned, he whispered, the word like iron on his tongue. The missing miles multiplied. He tried to track them on a paper map, tracing his route with a pen as the car rolled forward. At one point he marked the town he had just passed, its light still glowing in his rear-view mirror. 10 minutes later he looked again, and the map bore no trace of it. No town, no road junction, nothing. He pulled over again, walked into the snow, and turned. Behind him, darkness. The town was gone. When he returned to the car, the logbook lay open on the passenger seat, though he had left it closed in his duffel. A line of writing shimmered faintly. The corridor is not the road. He slammed it shut, but the words had already burned into his mind. By dawn he reached a stretch of highway he did not recognize. The trees leaned in close, branches arching overhead like ribs. His headlights caught geometric patterns etched faintly into the snowbanks, as though light itself had carved them. He slowed, pulse pounding. Then the world blinked. One moment he was driving. The next he was standing. Not on the road. Not in his car. He was inside a corridor. Vast. Endless. Glowing blue-white like frozen fire. The corridor had no floor, no ceiling. Only planes of geometry suspended in impossible alignment, stretching into distance that hurt his eyes. The air vibrated with a pulse that was not sound, but something deeper, a pressure in his bones. Suspended in the vastness hung machines. Not machines in the human sense. No rivets, no engines, no wings. They were structures of shifting light and metal that might have been alive. Some were as large as skyscrapers, rotating slowly as though in orbit around an invisible core. Others were delicate, lattice-like, their lines rearranging in silent rhythm. Reyes stumbled forward, his boots echoing on nothing. His hands trembled, his breath fogged though the air was neither warm nor cold. He whispered, "What are you?" The corridor answered with silence, and in that silence he felt watched. He moved toward one of the suspended forms. It resembled a gyroscope, but its rings intersected at impossible angles, rotating through each other without collision. As he drew close, the rings slowed, aligning with his movements. His pulse synced to their rhythm. A whisper brushed his mind. Not outside. Inside. He staggered back, clutching his head. The words were not sound. They were direct, inscribed across the fabric of thought itself. He gasped for air. The logbook appeared in his hands, though he had not carried it. Its pages flipped open, fluttering in invisible wind. Words etched themselves across the paper in glowing ink. "You are within the engine." Terror fought on inside him. He dropped the book, but it did not fall. It hovered, pages turning, diagrams forming in light. The same lattices he had drawn in sleepless nights, now alive and vast around him. He realized with a shudder that he was walking not through a place, but through the very diagrams themselves. He reached for the gyroscope again. His fingers passed through one of its glowing rings, and for an instant the world inverted. He saw Carter, his wingman, face pale, eyes wide, frozen mid-flight. Behind him the lattice glowed, wrapping his phantom like a net. Carter reached out, mouth open in a silent scream. Then the vision snapped. Reyes stumbled backward, choking. "Carter!" he shouted, the name echoing into infinity. The corridor pulsed. The gyroscope spun faster, retreating into distance. The logbook snapped shut in his hands. He walked for what felt like hours, though time had lost meaning. Distances folded. Sometimes he took a step and found himself miles further down the corridor. Sometimes he walked 10 minutes and looked back to see his footprints vanish into nothing. The machines turned slowly, indifferent to his presence, yet subtly shifting as he moved, as though he were part of their rhythm. Then he saw the chamber. It opened on his left, a vast dome suspended within the corridor. Inside hung a structure unlike the others. It was not abstract. It was a table. On it lay folders. Manila, stamped with words he could not read because they rearranged themselves each time he blinked. Some bore his name. Some bore Carter's. Some bore names he did not know. He approached slowly. The folders glowed faintly. He reached for one. The moment his fingers brushed it, the corridor convulsed. He was back in his car. The wheel jerked under his hands. Headlights blinded him. He slammed the brakes and skidded to a stop inches from a snowplow crawling the opposite lane. His chest heaved. Sweat soaked his shirt. The odometer read the same as it had an hour ago. The map on the seat was blank where town should have been, and on the passenger side lay the logbook, open to a page he had never written. Missing miles are not lost. They are stored. He stared, throat tight. He whispered, "Stored where?" The logbook shimmered once, then stilled. He drove the rest of the way in silence. The radio only hissed. The towns he passed looked normal, but he no longer trusted them. Every mile might vanish. Every face might dissolve. He clutched the wheel until his knuckles whitened. When he finally reached Fairbanks, he checked into another motel. He locked the door, set the logbook on the table, and stared at it until dawn. He did not open it. He was afraid of what would be waiting. The key marked B. 17 was cold enough to bite. A concrete stairwell breathed damp into Reyes's collar as he descended beneath the motel's laundry room. Basements in Alaska are usually about pipes and grudges. This one was about secrecy. Halfway down, he felt the familiar pressure gather, like a storm deciding a direction, and he paused, palm on the rail, the sentinel page whispering in memory. Do not answer in kind. Introduce human noise. If alignment begins, teach the room to prefer yours. He reached the door at the bottom, an old steel slab painted the color of resignation. The key slid into the lock and turned with a click that sounded louder than it should have in a hallway that held too much silence. He stepped into a corridor that looked like every utility corridor in every government building he'd ever been forced to memorize. Cinder block, conduit, fluorescent hum. Except for the air. The air had an intention. Locker B. 17 waited at the end, like a punctuation mark that only appears after the sentence decides what it wants to be. When he opened it, he found no papers, no folders, no stamped lies. Inside lay a small field radio with its case taped against rattle, a coil of cokes, 2 contact microphones, a battered metronome, and a single card typed in Courier. Resistance kit. Set the metronome at 74 BPM. Feed radio with voices, not music. Couple contact mics to metal around you. If geometry enters a canopy, desynchronize. At the bottom someone had written by hand, "Don't fight the river. Make it trip on stones." He smiled despite the cold in his stomach. "Stones," he said aloud, testing the word in the room. It felt human, imperfect, useful. He took everything, closed the locker, and killed the basement light on his way out as if darkness itself could be trained to change its preferences. Back in his room, he rehearsed until his hands knew the sequence without his eyes. The metronome's tick-tick carved 74 into his nerves. He tuned the field radio to a station where 2 hosts argued about whether snow tires should be studded or not. Interruptions, callers, laughter, coughs. He clipped the contact mics to the metal lip of the desk and to the radiator's rib side, listened as their copper nerves turned the room's vibrations into a thin, faithful thrum. He routed all of it through the little mixer he'd scavenged from the comms vault. Radio chatter in one channel, contact noise in another, the metronome marking time across the top like a drill sergeant who believed in syncopation. When the lattice pressed in, because it always pressed in eventually, he wanted a single gesture that said no in a language a machine could not parse as yes. Not obedience, not defiance. Friction. He slept in snatches with the radio low and the metronome off, the kit bag packed, boots by the door. At 3:40 his phone rang. Operations. Scramble. He didn't ask to whom or why, or whether this was another test disguised as an accident. He dressed, grabbed the bag, and left. The flight line was a cathedral of cold. Floodlights made halos on the tarmac. Crew chiefs moved with the blessed efficiency of men who worship function. Ray assigned, strapped, settled. The Phantom was a known quantity under his palms. Everything at reach, everything where time had taught him to expect it. He set the field radio on the combing beside his right knee, clipped the contact mic to the canopy frame, and taped the second mic to the aluminum edge beneath the instrument panel. He wound the coax to keep it out of the way and fixed a metronome with a strip of duct tape atop the right console where he could flick it blind. Eagle 2. AWACS crackled. Vector 310. Investigate intermittent returns at 35,000. Observe. Do not engage. Observe. Always observe. Always hold course. He taxied, took the runway, and let the Phantom climb into the black. The roar and the cold and the instruments brought sanity around him like a suit that fit too well to be questioned. Carter should have been on his wing. The absence sat where a human voice should live. At 28,000 feet, the first flicker kissed the radar sweep. At 30,000, a second flickered, not next to but through the first. The scope painting returns that contradicted each other politely. At 33,000, the canopy's edge lit with a faint blue-white line, as if Frost had learned Euclid. Eagle 2. AWACS again. We see your anomaly. Hold course. He didn't answer. He clicked the metronome. Tick, tick, tick. The machine's humble insistence filled the cockpit with human geometry. Imperfect, unyielding, made for feet and lungs, not for lattices. He dialed the field radio to the loudest idiots on the AM band. A caller named Mike believed studded tires were part of conspiracy to destroy pavement. The host laughed, coughed, interrupted. Human noise poured into the canopy. He rolled the contact mics up and heard his own machine talk back. The Phantom's metal sang quietly to itself at frequencies no checklist mentions. At 35,000, the lattice arrived. It did not rush. It declared. Blue-white angles unfolded beyond the nose. Lines finding lines. Planes building their argument. Stars bent very slightly, like good soldiers making way for a superior. The radar painted distance as a mood, near, far, both. His breath hitched. The first instinct sat up in him like a dog. Answer. The second instinct, trained last night in a basement where laundry goes to dry, took that instinct by the back of the neck and said no. He checked the metronome. 74 still. He dialed the radio up another notch. He tapped the contact mics with 2 fingers in an off pattern he'd practiced all the way to the base. 3-5-2-7. A sequence no machine chooses. A rhythm you can stomp but not solve. The geometry hesitated. Not by much. Not in any way he could have filmed. But he felt it in the small bones of his ears and the wells of the canopy frame. Like a dancer cutting across a beat she assumed would be there and finding gravel. He banked 5 degrees off the vector without asking, because the order hold course was always wrong when the course led through another thing's certainty. The lattice adjusted, following, attempting to realign the corridor around his heading. He broke the metronome for 2 ticks, 74 to 82 to 74 again, and the structure missed a step, a single miscount, like a choir forgetting a word. Eagle 2. AWACS said, a thread pulled through too much static. State fuel. Green, he said. Eagle 2 is green. He didn't say, I am teaching the room to prefer us. He didn't say Project Sentinel was right. He didn't say, Carter, if you can hear me, find a noise and hold it like a rope. The canopy filled with lines now, bright as winter noon. They entered the cockpit, not as light beams, but as decisions about where light was allowed. The contact mic on the frame spat a sound like a coin spun too long on a tabletop. The metronome ticked and ticked and ticked, and the radio produced an argument about bowling leagues so magnificently inane he nearly wept from gratitude. The yoke went heavy. Instruments went slender in their own ways, numbers turning with a reluctance that felt personal. He pulled and felt the machine resist, not as drag, but as preference. The engine note harmonized with something that lived beyond sound. Sweat ran cold in his suit, despite the cockpit heat. He pushed right rudder, left aileron, a cross command you never teach because you don't want it done, and the Phantom shuddered through a micro S-turn that made the lattice break its own line to keep up. Hold course, AWACS insisted. The phrase a prayer didn't know how to stop saying. No, he said, not on the radio, into the room. The stopwatch on the combing, dead since the night, the message you are next had burned its face. Clicked once. He glanced, unbelieving, as its second hand began to move, steady, mechanical, uninterested in halos and architected auroras. He laughed, one short, unhandsome bark, and the contact mics dutifully wrote his laugh into copper and fed it back into the mix. Human noise. The lattice pushed. He felt it not as force, but as grammar, clauses try to rearrange a sentence into theirs. He dropped the nose 2 degrees, insufficient as a maneuver, perfect as a refusal, and the metronome's implacable tick found his pulse and married it. For a second, no more, the geometry in the canopy lost its coherence. It blurred, not like a lens smeared with breath, not like heat shimmer, but like a thought abandoned mid-construction. The line in front of his eyes faltered, half a heartbeat late to its own logic. He banked again, small, petty, human. The Phantom's wing-bitten air that belonged to no one, and the sky remembered whose room it was. The lattice did not withdraw. It reconsidered. It stepped aside the way a crowd parts when a man carries a child, and both know what carrying means. Reyes leveled. He let the metronome run. He tuned the radio down until the hosts were only shape, then up until they were breath. He kept the contact mics live, and the stopwatch honest. He rode an argument instead of corridor. Behind the glare and the angles, something noticed, not malevolent, not benevolent, engaged. And in that engagement there was a boundary that had not existed 30 seconds prior. Not a wall, but a respect. He realized he was crying. He wiped his eyes with the back of his glove and didn't apologize to anyone, least of all the machine trying to tune him. Eagle 2, AWACS said, voice steadier. Paint is clean. Say status. Eagle 2 is steady, he answered, and left a miracle unreported because miracles die when made to wear uniforms. The geometry thinned. The aurora reclaimed its modesty. Stars agreed to be where charts said they should be. The radar returned to its job with sheepish professionalism. The metronome ticked on, outlasting the visitation like a heartbeat after a sprint. He let it run until the coast of ordinary felt trustworthy again. Then he flicked it off and sat with a blessed absence of tick for 3 breaths, long enough to notice that even silence can be loyal when you have earned it. On the ground, Harrington didn't ask the right questions. That was his way of asking them. Anything to report? The colonel said, reading nothing from a clipboard that held everything. Negative. Reyes said, routine interference. Cleared. Harrington studied him for the length of a held note. You look taller. Bad posture corrected, sir. The corner of the colonel's mouth did a thing it didn't do often. Very good. Outside, the wind moved snow across the tarmac in slow, low rivers. Reyes stood at the foot of the ladder and put a hand on the Phantom's skin. Metal meets skin in a conversation older than prayer. The jet was warm from flight and imperfect in ways that felt like forgiveness. He walked to the ready room with his kit bag heavier from being useful. Inside, pilots wrote lies of omission with grim efficiency. Dalton looked up, saw something in Reyes's face, and looked away because looking longer would be consent to hope. On the chalkboard someone had erased a sketch of a radar anomaly long ago, but chalk dust remembered like all useful things do. Reyes went home before dark. He set a radio in every room and turned them low. He cooked dinner slowly, making more noise than necessary on purpose, banging pans because rhythm matters. His daughter laughed at his clumsiness. His wife let her shoulder rest against his as he burned a pancake and declared it edible anyway. The dog licked the floor like absolution. After dishes, he went to his study, set the metronome at 74, and let it claim the corners. He opened the logbook. The page was blank, which was in its way a message. He wrote, "If you enter, you will have to learn to breathe with us." He closed the book and left the metronome ticking while he read his daughter to sleep. Tick, tick, tick. A house learning what kind of room it is. At 2:11, when the lamp usually flickered, it held steady. The stopwatch on the desk started itself again and kept time without arrogance. The metronome, at 74, married the second hand without eating it. He dreamed of the corridor, but from the outside, as if standing on a hill and watching weather over another town. Machines hung in their own considerations. One condition, pause, counted along with noise the dream had no speaker for, and did not mind being out of step. Morning brought a note under the door in the same hurried scrawl as before. You made it, Trip. Good. Next time it will try your mirrors. Tape paper over them. Touch metal. Eat with people. Call your wife first. Breathe loud. S. He taped paper over the mirrors. He touched metal on purpose. He called his wife first. He breathed loud. When he reported to the base, the medical review board stamp waited like a weather report. Fit. Conditional. Someone had underlined conditional twice, as if ink could summon a leash. He signed where they told him to sign, and kept the field radio in his bag, and the metronome in his pocket, and the contact mics coiled like answers not yet asked. In the hangar, Harrington handed him an envelope with nothing inside, and said, "Keep doing whatever you're not doing." It was the colonel's best blessing. Reyes nodded. "Aye, sir." Later, in the cockpit on a clear air test hop, he set the metronome at 74 out of habit and then, just to be rude, at 73 for 12 beats. He grinned when nothing in the sky liked it. He wasn't cured because this was an illness. He wasn't safe because this wasn't a war you could win. But he had a boundary that wasn't a wall. It was a song, and he could carry it. Above the Alaska Range, where the Aurora keeps its older promises, something watched a small machine carry 2 humans and a kit of noises and chose, for one measurable, merciful minute, not to rearrange their sentence. The Phantom came home on schedule. The logbook stayed closed until hands that had washed dishes and tucked in a child and touched a wife opened it. In the bottom corner of a page he hadn't written on yet, a thin, slanted hand wrote 2 words that did not glow, did not pulse, did not ask permission. Noted, learning. The base at Elmendorf was never meant to hold secrets of this magnitude. For years, its runways welcomed C-130s, F-15s, and transport aircraft ferrying equipment to and from the Arctic. But beneath the snowcake hangars and radar domes, there were rooms where sunlight never reached. These were spaces where voices lowered, where documents bore the word classified stamped in red, so thick it seemed to bleed through the page. Captain Elias Reyes had heard whispers of such places, rumors traded between pilots over beers, murmurs about the archive where reports went to disappear. It was said to be a bunker beneath the administrative wing, accessible only to those with clearances so rare that even squadron commanders weren't on the list. He had laughed those rumors off once. Now, after weeks of interrogation, after the silent tapes and the dossiers stamped subject in resonance, he was no longer laughing. On a cold February night, Major Dalton arranged a meeting. Dalton had aged fast. His face creased, his hands trembling slightly as he lit a cigarette in the empty motor pool. "Reyes," he said, voice low enough to be carried away by the wind. "You've been asking the wrong questions. You want answers? They're buried downstairs. But once you see them, there's no going back." Dalton pressed a folded scrap of paper into his palm. Coordinates. A time. Nothing else. The corridors of the administrative wing were dead quiet after midnight. Reyes wore his uniform, not because he believed it would help, but because it gave him an air of belonging. He followed Dalton's directions past a row of offices where portraits of generals stared down at him from gilded frames. He found the service stairwell, pushed it open, and descended into concrete silence. At the bottom was a steel door without markings, guarded not by armed MPs, but by a simple electronic lock. Dalton's note had included a 6-digit sequence. Reyes entered it. The lock clicked. The room beyond was not what he expected. It wasn't cinematic, no glowing vaults, no humming machines. It was a records room, dusty, dim, with rows of filing cabinets and microfilm readers that looked like relics from the Cold War. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead. On the center table lay 3 folders, already open. Someone had prepared them. The first folder contained photographs, grainy black and white images, of circular objects above the Bering Sea, taken from reconnaissance planes in 1952. The captions noted geometric maneuvers inconsistent with known propulsion. Next to the photographs were transcripts of radio chatter, pilots describing shapes of light, voices tight with fear, then silence. The last entry, contact lost. The second folder was worse. It held medical reports, autopsy diagrams, not of pilots, but of animals pulled from rural crash sites, bones irradiated, nervous systems fried, as if by directed energy, margins scrawled with notes, patterns suggestive of resonance, frequency imprint remains in tissue. Reyes's hands trembled as he turned the pages. The third folder was thin but heavier in weight. Inside was a typed memorandum, stamped 1968. It spoke of Project Conductor. Lines of technical jargon blurred in his vision, but the key passage was underlined twice. Subject exposed to lattice contact exhibit altered perception of time, enhanced anticipatory response, and eventual dissociation from spatial anchor. Recommendation: controlled observation only. Termination advised if integration exceeds threshold. Beneath the memo was a list of names. Some were crossed out. Some had dates beside them. His eyes stopped on one entry, Captain Jonathan Hale's status. Unaccounted. Reyes dropped the folder as if it had burned him. He had heard that name whispered months earlier in the ready room, attached to rumors of a pilot who simply never returned from a routine mission. Now it was here on paper, consigned to a status colder than death. Unaccounted. The sound of footsteps broke his trance. He turned. Dalton entered, his expression unreadable. "You wanted truth," Dalton said, taking the cigarette from his lips. "This is it. They've been dealing with this since before we were born. Every time one of us touches it, sees it, he's marked. You saw it in the sky, didn't you? That lattice? Then you know what's coming." Reyes tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. Instead, he gestured at the folders. "How many?" he asked finally. Dalton exhaled. Smoke curled into the fluorescent light. "Too many. They track us like entries in a ledger. Pilots, ground crews, even civilians. Some vanish. Some change. The rest are silenced." He paused. "And now you're in the file, too." Reyes left the archive with the images burned into his memory. That night, he sat in his quarters, staring at his reflection in the dark window. For the first time, he noticed the faintest shimmer, like threads of blue-white light crawling along the glass, tracing geometric patterns only he could see. He remembered the phrase from the memo, dissociation from spatial anchor. It chilled him more than any threat of court-martial ever had. He thought of Hale, of the word unaccounted. He pressed the record button on his cassette machine, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is Captain Elias Reyes. Tonight, I saw the Black Archive. The files prove what they won't admit, that the lattice is not weather, not radar malfunction, not imagination. It's real. It has touched others before me. And every one of them is gone. If I disappear, let this tape be proof. They knew." Outside, the aurora rippled faintly over the Alaskan night. Its colors shifted, not in arcs or curtains, but in straight-edged angles, like geometry written across the sky. Reyes did not sleep. The first signs that Captain Elias Reyes was no longer fully anchored to the world of ordinary men came not during a mission, nor in an interrogation room, nor even in the dead silence of his study with the tape spinning. They came in transit, between one place and another, in the shallow space where the mind wanders and reality is fragile. He was driving back from Elmendorf late one evening, clouds low, drizzle hissing against the windshield. The road stretched ahead empty. His eyes caught a tremor, not of the wipers, not of the lights of Anchorage in the distance, but the air itself. The lattice shimmered faintly across the wet asphalt, like geometry half-formed, dissolving as quickly as it appeared. He blinked hard, pulled the wheel slightly, and felt his tires resist, as though the very road had restructured for an instant beneath him. Later, he could not say how long the episode lasted. He remembered a song on the radio skipping like a damaged record, repeating a fragment of melody 3 times before resuming. He remembered gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached, and he remembered the uncanny stillness afterward, as though the lattice had brushed him and then withdrawn. At home, he tried to dismiss it. He told himself fatigue was a culprit, that stress and repetition had carved illusions into his sight. But denial lasted only until the following week, when the phenomena began intruding even into the sanctuaries of routine. He would pour coffee, set the mug down, and glance back to find the handle rotated to a different angle than he left it. He would write in his logbook, lift the pen, and the words, his words, would faintly glow for an instant before dimming back into ink. In mirrors, his reflection blinked half a second out of sync. The most alarming was the presence in the cockpit. During a maintenance check flight in a trainer, low altitude, routine circuits, Reyes felt the lattice form inside the canopy. Not outside, not on the horizon, but folding across the glass like frost. Blue-white patterns scrolled silently across his visor, aligning themselves with the gauges, threading into the very instruments. He shouted into the radio. His own voice came back with faint delay, like a poorly tuned broadcast. He landed hard, taxi back pale and sweating, the maintenance officer rushing to the ladder. Reyes said nothing. He simply descended, pulled off his helmet, and pressed it into the officer's chest with trembling hands. The investigators noticed. They always noticed. By then, surveillance was constant. Unmarked cars idled near his house. Calls clicked with faint interference. Every trip to the base was logged. And still, the phenomena persisted. It was at this stage Reyes began speaking of the overlay. He confided once, only once, to Dalton, that the lattice was not simply appearing but merging. It's like, my world and theirs are superimposed, he said, his voice low, as though microphones lurked even in the bar shadows. Sometimes the angles match. Sometimes they don't. And when they don't, everything shakes. Dalton, older, wary, did not press. He drank, looked away, and muttered, "They won't let you talk about that. Not if it's what I think it is." At home, his wife saw the changes too. She begged him to rest, to see a doctor. Once, during an argument, the kitchen lights flickered, then bent, as if the bulbs had sagged into arcs. His daughter screamed. Reyes reached out instinctively, and the light snapped back, leaving scorch marks on the fixtures. No one mentioned it again, but the silence at the dinner table became unbearable. The Air Force, for its part, moved him quietly into medical review. Psychiatric evaluation, they called it. He nodded, filled out forms, let the doctors ask about sleep, about memory, about hallucinations. He lied, carefully, professionally, but in his tapes, his true voice emerged. Panicked, cracking, desperate. They're inside the frame now, not just outside, inside. I see them in corners, in reflections. When I blink, the afterimage doesn't fade. It multiplies. They're aligning me. That's what this is. Alignment. The climax came on a night alone in his study. The recorder spun, its reels glowing faintly, not with their red indicator, but with something else. Geometry bled across the plastic casing, lines too perfect, too precise. The air vibrated. Reyes pressed both palms against the desk and whispered, "Not yet. Please. Not yet." The lattice did not obey. The room dissolved around him, not vanishing, but reordering. Walls stretched, contracted, bent inward. His desk became a platform of glowing filaments. The window was no longer glass, but a portal into a sky of suspended machines. His body trembled, not from fear but from resonance, as if his very bones were vibrating in sympathy with a frequency older than language. When it released him, hours had passed. His study was intact. The recorder sat where it had always sat. But his skin glowed faintly in the dark, and his hands bore lines, subtle but unmistakable, traced in blue-white geometry across his veins. By morning, he could not hold a mug without the liquid rippling unnaturally. He could not stand in sunlight without casting double shadows. Neighbors whispered. His wife avoided his eyes. His daughter locked her door at night. The military came again. 2 men, dark suits, hard eyes. They said nothing about lattice or resonance. They said only, "Captain Reyes, for your safety and the safety of this country, you are relieved of all duties effective immediately." He nodded, expression blank. He already knew. The lattice had shown him the moment the night before, word for word, gesture for gesture. In his final tapes from that week, Reyes spoke not as a pilot, not as a soldier, but as a man halfway gone. It isn't about sighting anymore. It isn't about evidence. It's about surrender. They're not asking permission. They're rewriting coordinates. Space, time, flesh. Every part of me is an address in their geometry, and they're calling a home. The tape clicked, word, fell silent, and in that silence, the dissolution continued. The memo was stamped medical review, priority. But the language buried inside the pages was nothing like standard procedure. Reyes had seen dozens of evaluations in his career. Neurological assessments after high-G maneuvers, post-combat screenings, psychiatric checklists for pilots returning from classified sorties. This was different. This was not medicine. This was classification masquerading as care. The opening line struck him first. Subject demonstrates anomalous alignment with unverified aerial phenomena. Recommend continue containment under pretense of psychological instability. They were not evaluating him. They were categorizing him. The meeting took place in a sterile room at the base hospital, the kind painted in colors chosen to calm, but that instead drained life. A colonel he did not know sat at the head of the table. 2 men in civilian suits flanked him. On the table, the folder, thin, precise, damning. "Captain Reyes," the colonel began, voice neutral. "This review is to determine your medical fitness for continued service." Reyes said nothing. He let the silence drag. One of the civilians spoke next, his accent faint but his words rehearsed. "Your case is unique, Captain. We've documented phenomena associated with your proximity to aerial anomalies, physiological changes, perceptual alterations. These do not correspond to any known disorder. For this reason, you are now considered a special case." The phrase landed like a verdict. Special case. Not pilot. Not officer. Not even patient. Something else entirely. They questioned him for hours. Did he still experience distortions in vision? Did he hear voices? Did he feel compelled to act against his will? Reyes answered sparingly. Yes. No. Sometimes. The colonel leaned forward finally, expression unreadable. "Captain, we can offer treatment. Relocation. Privacy. But you must comply. You must stop recording. You must surrender any tapes, notes, or files you've kept." Reyes's jaw clenched. He remembered the box he had buried in the forest. He remembered the glowing words in his logbook. He remembered the lattice crawling across his hands. He shook his head. No. The room froze. The civilians exchanged a glance. The colonel exhaled slowly, as if disappointed but not surprised. "Then you understand the consequences." They grounded him officially the next day. The letter was brief, indefinite non-flight status due to medical review findings. The justification was vague, clinical, but the effect was total. He would never fly again. Word spread quietly among the squadron. Some men avoided his gaze. Others looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear. He was no longer one of them. He was a warning. Dalton found him that evening at the edge of the tarmac, watching the F-15s roar into the sky without him. The older pilot said nothing at first. He simply stood beside Reyes, hands in pockets, eyes on the departing jets. Finally, he murmured, "They've marked you. Once you're marked, there's no coming back." Reyes asked, voice low, "What did you see, Dalton? Back then? What made you stop flying?" Dalton's lips tightened. He didn't answer. He only walked away, leaving Reyes staring into the contrails fading against the dark. At home, things unraveled further. His wife tried to maintain routine, but her patience had limits. Their daughter avoided him entirely. Neighbors whispered about strange lights seen above the house, about radios that crackled when he walked past. Packages arrived at the door with no return address. Inside, photocopies of documents, blurry photographs of radar screens, anonymous notes that said things like "You are a conduit." Reyes began to wonder whether these were leaks from sympathizers within the system or deliberate manipulations designed to push him further. Either way, the message was the same. He was no longer just an observer. He was part of the phenomenon. The true confirmation came during another interrogation, this one off base, in a facility he did not recognize. The men did not introduce themselves. They asked about his dreams. They asked whether he ever woke up with marks on his skin. They asked whether he had noticed missing time. He lied again. But as he spoke, one of the men slid a photograph across the table. Reyes stared. It was him, in uniform, but the photograph was wrong. His body was transparent, lattice light flowing through him. The background was a hangar he did not remember standing in. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. The man simply said, "It's not where, it's when." That night, he could not sleep. He played the tape recorder again, but even the machine betrayed him. The reel spun without power, emitting a faint hum. When he pressed stop, the voice that continued was not his own. It was layered, harmonic, inhuman. It said, "You are not observed. You are chosen." Reyes ripped the tape from the reels, shredded it, buried the fragments in the trash. But the hum persisted in the air long after. By the following week, the phrase "special case" had spread across every document, every interaction. His medical forms, his security clearance, his personnel file. No one said the words aloud, but everyone acted as though they carried the weight of exile. And through it all, the lattice grew bolder. In reflections, it appeared more solid. In his hands, the glowing lines deepened, pulsing faintly. His very shadow seemed to fracture into geometric shards when he walked beneath street lamps. Reyes realized then that the classification was not a mistake. They weren't misdiagnosing him. They were acknowledging the truth. He was no longer entirely human in the way they understood. He was a bridge, a special case. In his last tape from that period, his voice trembled but carried a strange calm. "I understand now. The review, the documents, the interrogations. It's not about fitness for duty. It's about acknowledgement. They know I've crossed the threshold. They know the lattice isn't outside anymore. It's in me. I am not a pilot with a condition. I am a condition. That's why they watch me. That's why they fear me. That's why they label me a special case." The tape clicked off, and in the silence, the lattice pulsed, patient, inevitable, waiting for the next stage. They did not tell him when the threshold would be crossed. They only gave it names that sounded like doors. Special case, non-flight, observation. But doors do not announce the instant the hinge becomes a pivot. One day you put your hand on the knob and realize the room on the other side grew around you while you were busy pretending to leave. Reyes felt it first in his breath. It happened on a Wednesday that smelled of solvent and thawing snow. He was standing in the hangar, not flying, never flying again, helping a crew chief inventory panels and fasteners for a bird that would depart without him. He lifted a crate, and his lungs drew air that didn't belong to the hangar. It belonged to the corridor. Bright, clean, the taste of cold metal sung to temperature, the faint ionized tang that lives near lightning before it admits itself. He froze with the crate halfway up, eyes unfocused, listening to his own ribs resonate like plucked strings. "Cap?" the crew chief said, one hand still counting, the other hand still pretending not to worry about the way Reyes no longer fit the edges of rooms. "I'm fine," Reyes lied and set the crate down. The concrete under his boots hummed back, a reply not in sound but in willingness. The hangar remembered him, or the lattice inside him taught the hangar how to. He left early without permission and discovered the permission had been pre-approved. The guard at the gate waved with the solemn friendliness of man, with a list in front of him. Outside the wire, the sky wore the late-season aurora like a rumor, Faint veils, a little green, a bruise of violet that wouldn't confess. He drove without destination, radio low, the metronome in his jacket ticking when it chose to tick and silent when preferred to think. By the time he reached the overlook above Nick Arm, the light had collapsed into blue. Water moved below like a creature rehearsing sleep. Reyes killed the engine and sat with his hands on the wheel because hands need a job. The logbook on the passenger seat had opened itself again, but it showed no words, only blank, deliberate paper like a held breath. Then say it, he told the blankness. Tired of being the only voice in a dialogue that swallowed rooms, ranks, and reason. Say what you want. The windshield filled with angles. Not flashing, not intruding. Aligning. The geometry did what a conductor does when he lifts a baton before silence becomes arrangement. Lines rose from edges of glass no man had machined. Planes resolved from seams no engineer had designed. Out over the mudflats, the air found a structure older than weather. Reyes didn't grip the wheel tighter. He loosened his hands and let his palms hover, as if offering the car itself to an orchestra pit he could finally see. "You're early," he whispered, and the sentence didn't feel like fear. The stopwatch in his pocket started. He did not take it out. Let it keep time. Let it have a job. 2. The passenger door clicked. No weight entered, no body, no cold. But something sat beside him, a presence in the shape of attention. The logbook turned a page. He did not look down. He kept his eyes on the sky, because the sky had finally stopped pretending to be sky. "Carter," he said, not because he believed, not because he didn't, but because names are lines we throw into deep water to see what tugs. The angles at the horizon flexed like muscle under silk. From the corner of his eye, he saw letters stand up on the page and then sit down again, as shy as animals at the edge of a clearing. He reached the metronome and set it to 74, then, out of respect, not defiance, clicked it one notch slower. 73. Human. Wrong in a way that invites. The windshield geometry breathed with him. In. Out. The lines didn't pulse so much as agree. He spoke, without realizing he had decided to. "I consent to noise," he said, "and I refuse to cease." The sentence felt ridiculous and correct. He said another because momentum matters. "If you are going to use me, you will carry more than calculation. You will carry laughter and interruptions, and the way my daughter drops a spoon when the dog bumps her knee." A faint ripple passed through the lattice, a tremor of miscount or amusement. He could not tell which. The stopwatch in his pocket stuttered 1 second. Tick, tick, tick. He smiled in spite of the fear that lived in his bones like debt. The passenger seat warmed. He did not turn. He let the warmth reach him sideways like a remembered hand. "Don't take me the way you took him," he said, gentler than he had expected of his own mouth. "If you know boundaries now, show me one. Let me stand in a doorway and keep a foot on each floor." A line wrote itself at the top of the windshield. Letters formed by absence rather than light. The way snow spells when a fence has already made up its mind. Breath is the boundary. He laughed, a quick, ugly sound that he loved for his lack of awe. "Then breathe with me," he said. They did, for a measurable minute, because the stopwatch in his pocket was not a liar anymore. The geometry matched his inhale, lagged his exhale, caught up, fell behind, learned, failed, learned again. He discovered the strange tenderness of teaching a machine to pant. At the 28th second, he began to cry and didn't stop the lesson. At the 42nd, the metronome decided to be bold and added a faint syncopation of its own. At 59, the angles outside the car held shape through an entire human sigh, without reasserting a superior grammar. When the minute ended, nothing ended. The boundaries stayed where breath had set them. "Good," he said to the windshield and to the seat and to the water and to whatever kept stars honest. "Good." The passenger door clicked again. Not departure. A courtesy. The logbook closed with the relief of a duty finished. On its cover, Frost traced a staff in 4 measures. He wiped it away with his sleeve and found ink underneath. "Conductor." "Terrible title," he muttered, and then more quietly, "I'll take it." He drove home through a world that had learned to keep both songs in the same measure. Streetlights refused a bend. Radios argued amiably. The Aurora minded its on-off switch like a citizen. He walked through his front door into a house that remembered what kitchens were for. Laura was at the sink. She didn't start when he entered. She didn't step back. She kept her hands in warm water and looked at him like a person decides to look at another person. By choice, not by fear. "You look," she said, "like you've been crying in the car." "I have," he said. "Good," she answered, and let him kiss the wet back of her hand. He cooked loudly. He burned nothing and still banged every pan twice. He turned the radio to a baseball game broadcast from far enough south that the language arrived with a little heat in it, then turned it down to let Fork speak. The dog thumped the floor in June 8th. His daughter told a story that didn't have a point and refused to find one. When the table fell quiet, it did so because fullness like silence after it has done its work, not because terror had stolen verbs. Later, he taped paper over every mirror again, not as a ward but as a reminder. The boundary is not the wall. It is the song. On the paper in the bathroom, he wrote, in fat black marker, "Breathe loud," and below it, "Laugh first." He meant it. The house learned it. At 2:11, the lamp that used a flicker kept its promise. At 2:12, the metronome, which he hadn't set, ticked once on the dresser and then thought better showing off. He slept through to morning for the first time since Carter. The base did not change because a man had. Institutions metabolize miracles at the speed of policy. The letter that had arrived on Monday, fit, conditional, still sat on his desk on Thursday with the same underline under the same word. In the ready room, the pact of silence kept eating its own tail, an eternal, frightened Ouroboros. In the hangar, someone had left a coffee mug with the word Sentinel scratched into the glaze by a key. No one admitted owning the key or the mug. Harrington said, "Walk with me," and did not ask questions as they walked. In the comms vault, the repeater hummed. Reyes tuned the coil by listening with his fingertips. He fed in the sound of a mess hall argument over chili recipes, looped it, and watched the scope draw a rough rectangle where a mouth had been. Harrington leaned in the doorway and practiced not looking surprised. "This is not the part where I ask what you're doing," the colonel said. "No, sir," Reyes agreed. "This is the part where I ask if you can do it again when it matters." "Yes, sir," Reyes said, and because he was honest now in a way that hurt less than lying, added, "Maybe." Harrington nodded. "I'll take maybe." He left a small envelope on the bench. Inside, a single strip of paper with a typed sentence. When addressed, do not answer in kind. When welcome, do. No signature. No instructions. Reyes put it in his pocket next to the stopwatch that had learned to be faithful and the metronome that had learned humility. On the way out, he passed Dalton at the end of the corridor. The older pilot's eyes had the exhausted brightness of men who want to hope and have forgotten which muscle fires that gesture. "Is it worse?" Dalton asked. No preamble. Just the only question he could carry. "It's louder," Reyes said. Dalton blinked. "Louder bad or louder good?" "Louder ours," Reyes said, and watched the sentence land where it needed to. Dalton nodded once. Then if it calls again, he said, "Don't go alone." "I won't," Reyes said, and meant it like Val. The call did not come by phone or by order. It arrived the way weather does, a pressure, an agreement, a door the air discovers. Reyes felt it on a night that had the decency to be clear. Harrington met him on the line with the kind of permission that uses no paper. Dalton walked out behind them and said nothing and strapped in. A junior pilot named Cho, who laughed too hard at bad jokes and flew like one of God's wrists, came on the wing because you cannot teach a sky with just past tense. They went up with radios already arguing, metronomes taped where knees could find them, contact mics clicking as a canopy said what canopies say when they remember heat. At 28,000, the lattice made its announcement. At 31,000, it began to arrange clauses. At 33,000, Reyes raised a hand the way a conductor does when he asks brass to wait for strings. "Breathe with me," he said, not on the net, not in prayer in the room, for bodies did, for machines tried, the geometry considered. The stopwatch in Reyes's pocket kept time like a humble friend. For a minute measurable by anything that cared to measure, an impossible structure matched for human exhalations in sequence. Reyes. then Dalton, then Cho, then the Phantom itself, which had not been designed to breathe, and learn anyway. The lattice blinked. Not off, not on, but like an eye that has discovered the courtesy of lids. When it finished, it did not take anyone. It stepped aside and let them pass, as if a corridor had learned the meaning of yield. On the ground, no report captured it. No form had a box, for we were sung through. Reyes did not try to write it down. He went home and put 2 fingers on Laura's wrist and counted with a gratitude so physical it made his knees weak. He opened the logbook at the kitchen table, because sometimes altars are oak and have ring stains. He wrote, "If you will pass through me, you will keep what I keep." The page warmed under his hand. No letters appeared. No glow admitted itself. In the window above the sink, the night reflected a kitchen that loved itself enough to hum. In that reflection, for the briefest and most merciful of frames, Carter stood in the doorway behind him and nodded once. Approval, apology, some mixture of those human alloys, and dissolved not into lattice but into the kind of absence that heals. Reyes closed the book and let it be blank, because blankness can be true once you learn what to put in the air. He slept without asking permission. Far above, a machine that wasn't in a sky that was reconsidered the grammar contact and wrote, for the first time in their long, unlonely history, a small rest into the measure. They told the story later in fragments. Neighbors, fellow pilots, men who had looked at him across tables and seen something already lifting from his skin. But no one could account for the exact moment Captain Elias Reyes ceased to belong to the inventory of the United States Air Force or to the registers of ordinary flesh. The last full day began without warning. Reyes woke early, the air in his house strangely still. His wife and daughter had gone to stay with her sister the week before, after nights of flickering lamps and voices on the radio that were not voices. He moved through the kitchen quietly, touching surfaces like a man cataloging what would not return with him. The metronome sat on the counter, silent, though he had not wound it down. His logbook waited on the table, unopened but warm. He ate nothing. He drank water. He wrote a single line before leaving. "If they call, I will not refuse." At the base, his presence caused no alarm. The paperwork said he was on medical review, grounded indefinitely. He had no access to aircraft, no clearance for active duty. But the guard waved him through the gate, eyes glassy, posture slack, as though the decision had been made elsewhere. In the ready room, the others avoided his gaze. Dalton was not there. Harrington had been summoned to Washington. The young pilots wrote in their flight logs as if carving silence into the page. Reyes stood among them like a shadow, waiting, until the loudspeaker cracked faintly with static. It did not call his name. It did not call any name. It simply made a sound that he recognized, not language, but alignment. He walked out without a word. No one stopped him. That night, the aurora returned, stronger than before. The sky above Anchorage was not green or violet, but a pallid, blinding white, like frost illuminated from within. Reyes drove until the road ended at the tree lean. He carried the logbook, the metronome, the stopwatch. He carried nothing else. The forest was quiet. Snow cracked under his boots. Between the trees, the lattice already waited. It did not hover above or curl distant at the horizon. It stood between trunks like scaffolding, infinite and intimate, waiting for a conductor's baton to lift. He set the logbook down on a flat stone. He placed the metronome beside it, wound it once, let it tick. The stopwatch glowed faintly in his pocket, unasked. "All right," he said, voice steady. "I'm here." The lattice answered without sound. It simply breathed in. The air rushed past his ears, rattled branches, bent shadows. His chest filled with it, ribs vibrating like tuned glass. He exhaled, and the structure exhaled with him. He took a step forward. Witnesses saw the light from miles away. Hikers near Eagle River described a dome of blue-white geometry rising from the forest, pulsing once, then steadying like a held cord. Radar at Elmendorf recorded nothing but interference, a spike that blew out screens, erasing all else. Inside, Reyes stood on ground that was no longer ground. The snow dissolved into glowing filaments. The trees bent into angles that made sense only to an intelligence outside the catalog of botany. He stood at the center of a corridor that unfolded and refolded, a machine made of silence and patience. The stopwatch ticked once more. He raised it in his hand and let it go. It did not fall. It hung in air, spinning slowly, then aligned itself with the lattice lines and vanished into them, absorbed without resistance. The metronome stopped. He felt his body shifting, not pulled apart but invited outward. Skin dissolved first, pores expanding into luminous dust. Muscles unwound into threads of light. Bones trembled, then sang, then bent until they were part of the corridor's structure. He was not leaving. He was joining. For an instant, long enough to measure in the language of awe, he saw himself reflected in geometry. Not a man, not a pilot, but conductor, arms raised, baton invisible, leading a symphony of angles. The lattice hummed in response, a choir of machines older than stars, waiting for his cue. He breathed once more. In, out, and the corridor aligned perfectly with him. The hunters who arrived later found the clearing empty. No footprints led away. The snow was fused into a smooth, glassy surface, as if scorched by heat that left no smoke. On the stone lay the logbook, open to a blank page. No words, no glowing letters. Only one faint scorch mark at the bottom edge, shaped like the curve of a metronome's pendulum. The Air Force classified the report immediately. The official explanation: Reyes had suffered a psychological break, wandered into the wilderness, and succumbed to exposure. His body was never recovered. Unofficially, the men who had flown with him refused to believe it. Dalton drank harder, spoke less, but when asked, he muttered, "He didn't go missing. He went through." Harrington, when pressed in Washington, only said, "We lost an officer. We gained something else. Don't ask me to define it." At Elmendorf, the pilots continued their flights. But in the ready room, flight logs began appearing with empty lines left deliberately blank. Silent acknowledgments. Spaces waiting for a name that had been erased, but not forgotten. In the months that followed, sightings multiplied. Blue-white structures appeared over the Aleutians, shimmering for minutes before fading. Civilians reported hearing faint metronome ticks in static on their radios. One fisherman swore his stopwatch froze at 73 seconds, while the aurora above his boat shifted into perfect squares. And always, when asked, the witnesses used the same phrase without knowing why. It was like something was conducting. Years later, the logbook found on the stone was cataloged into an archive, misfiled under meteorological data. Archivists noted its odd warmth, as though the paper retained body heat. On the last page, faint and nearly invisible, new words had appeared. "If you pass through me, keep what I kept." The archivist closed the book quickly, unwilling to admit he had seen the letters form as he read. In the final assessment, Captain Elias Reyes did not vanish. He was not erased. He was aligned, and somewhere in a corridor made not of walls but of resonance, the lattice still waits, geometry holding its breath for the next note.